The Duke's mother had her hair trimmed the night before the wedding. She said it was tradition. Charlotte heard the scissors before she understood what they were doing. The sound came from behind the door at the far end of the east corridor. A sharp, deliberate snip, then a pause of absolute silence, then another. Clean and precise, the way a person cuts when they are not hurrying and do not intend to make a mistake. It was past 10 o'clock at night, and most of Ashcombe Hall had drawn itself into quiet. The candles in the iron wall sconces had been turned down low, and long, slow pools of shadow filled the spaces between their amber circles of light. The carpet beneath Charlotte's feet was thick enough to swallow every footstep completely, so that she moved through the corridor without a sound, which meant the sound of those scissors was the only thing there was to hear, and it carried with a clarity that should not have been possible through a heavy closed door. Her feet stopped moving of their own decision. She had come down from her room only to find a glass of water. Her maid Clara had retired early. Charlotte had told her to, there being no reason for the girl to stay awake, simply because Charlotte found it difficult to sleep on the eve of the most significant day of her life thus far. The water jug was on a side table 2/3 of the way down the east corridor, set out every evening as a matter of course. It was a 10-minute errand. She had not expected to hear anything. She had not expected to stand in the half-dark of an old corridor at 10 o'clock at night, with her attention pulled tight by a sound she had not been meant to notice. But the scissors rang out again, and Charlotte's breathing slowed and quieted, without her making any deliberate decision to quieten it. Behind the door, a woman's voice said something low and measured. Then the cutting sound came once more. A single, deliberate snip, unhurried, with the quality of someone who had been told exactly where to cut and was making certain to do it correctly. Then nothing. Then one final cut, barely audible, the lightest possible pressure of blades. Charlotte knew whose rooms were at the end of this corridor. That afternoon, Mrs. Pemberton had walked her through every wing of Ashcombe Hall in a tour so thorough and so precisely paced that Charlotte had come away with the sense not of having been shown a house, but of having been briefed on it, given all relevant information in the correct order, with the important details appropriately emphasized. Mrs. Pemberton was the kind of housekeeper who treated her responsibilities the way a navigator treats a chart, with complete seriousness and an absence of unnecessary ornamentation. She had silver hair that she wore in a practical arrangement, a posture that suggested someone who had never in her life slumped against anything, and the particular authority of a person who has run a large and complicated household for so long that the household has, in some meaningful sense, become an extension of herself. The rooms at the end of the east corridor, Mrs. Pemberton had explained with the same tone she used for everything, measured, factual, neither warm nor cold, belonged to Dowager Duchess Eleanor, the mother of the man Charlotte was to marry in less than 12 hours. She should have walked away. Charlotte understood this. The hour was wrong, the occasion was wrong, and what a woman chose to do behind her own door at 10 o'clock at night was not the business of anyone standing in the corridor outside it. She was the guest here, or had been the guest until tomorrow, when she would become something else. Whatever the Duchess was doing in the privacy of her own rooms was exactly that, private. The polite and sensible action was to continue to the water jug, pour her glass, and go back to bed. Charlotte had grown up in a household where polite was respected and sensible was admired. She had also grown up in a household where her father spent his working days examining documents that had been made to look more ordinary than they were, and where his most consistent advice to his daughters was this: the things that are made to look like nothing are usually the things that are everything. She took 3 very careful steps toward the door. It was not fully closed. The corridor was dark enough that she had not seen the sliver of light coming through the gap, but she could see it now from this angle. A thin, warm line along the door's edge, pale gold from candles inside, and through the gap itself, if she placed herself at precisely the right angle on the corridor carpet, she could see a narrow slice of the room beyond. What she saw made her catch her breath and hold it without deciding to. Dowager Duchess Eleanor sat in a high-backed chair that had been drawn to face the vanity mirror on the far wall. She wore a dressing gown in deep burgundy, and her silver-white hair, which Charlotte had seen every time they met, arranged in the kind of immaculate, authoritative style that added a particular quality of command to an already commanding presence, was down. It fell loose around her shoulders and past them, down toward the middle of her back, longer and thicker than Charlotte would have guessed, from its usual arrangement. In the candlelight, it had a liquid quality, silver and cool and very still. Standing behind her was a maid Charlotte had not seen during the afternoon's tour of the house. She was young, 17 at the most, possibly younger, and she held a pair of scissors in both hands. The scissors were silver-handled, small, the kind made for fine work rather than ordinary cutting. She held them with both hands, in the careful, two-handed grip of someone who had been given a very precise instruction and was using the full force of her concentration to carry it out correctly. On the surface of the vanity, in front of the Duchess, sat a small oval locket, silver, plain, with a simple engraved border, already open, its two halves lying flat against the polished surface, like a hand held out, waiting. Beside the locket was a square of white cloth, folded into thirds, with a precision that could not have been accidental. As Charlotte watched, the maid lifted a single lock of hair from behind the Duchess's left ear. She held it carefully between the first and second fingers of her left hand, keeping it taut without pulling, and brought the scissors close. She drew a slow breath that Charlotte could actually see from the corridor, the rise and fall of the girl's slight shoulders. Then she cut. The lock came free. It was perhaps 3 inches in length, no more, fine and silver white, and so light it barely changed position when the scissors parted it. The maid held it without letting it fall, with the careful, almost reverential delicacy of someone handling something irreplaceable. Then she turned toward the vanity, and with the same deliberate care, she laid the lock of hair on the white cloth. The Duchess spoke. Her voice was too low for Charlotte to make out the words through the gap, but the tone was clear. Instruction, measured and calm, neither hurried nor uncertain. The maid nodded once. She folded the white cloth around the lock of hair in 3 precise movements, each one following the last without pause. She lifted the folded packet, held it for a moment, then set it inside the open locket and pressed it down gently with her thumb. The locket closed. The sound it made was very small, a quiet, definitive click, but in the stillness of the room, it was clearly audible through the gap. Eleanor let out a long, slow breath. Her eyes fell closed. Her hands, which had been resting on the carved arms of the chair with her fingers slightly curled, uncurled, and went flat against the wood, as though released. It was the breath of someone who has finished something that needed finishing, not with relief in the ordinary sense, not with the flush of something unpleasant that is finally behind you, but with the quieter, more settled feeling of an obligation discharged, something carried to its proper conclusion. Then her eyes opened. They found Charlotte in the mirror. Charlotte did not move. She had not decided not to move. The decision did not arise because her body simply did not generate the impulse to step back, to step aside, to pretend. She stood where she stood and held the Duchess's gaze in the mirror, and the thing she noticed first, before anything else, was that the Duchess was not startled. There was no flinch, no quick gathering of something to conceal, no reaching for an explanation. Eleanor looked at Charlotte's reflection with the same steadiness with which she had apparently been conducting the whole of the proceeding, composed, measured, and entirely, specifically, purposefully unsurprised. Underneath the composure, visible in the quality of the gaze, there was something else. Charlotte would think about it later, work it over in the way she worked over anything she needed to understand, and the word she would keep returning to was warning. Not threat, not hostility. Warning. The kind you give to someone not to frighten them but because you have decided they need to know something. Then Eleanor's eyes moved from the mirror toward the window, and she said, quite clearly and without raising her voice, "That will be all, Agnes." Charlotte walked to the end of the corridor. She did not hurry. She found the water jug and poured a glass, and she stood at the window and drank it slowly and looked out at the grounds of Ashcombe Hall, disappearing into the darkness of the grounds. The estate was enormous and old. The main house had been built in the early 18th century, on foundations that were older still. There was a section of cellar that dated to the 1500s, Mrs. Pemberton had mentioned, with the same equable tone she used for everything. And even in the daylight, the house had carried the quality of a building that had absorbed a great deal without being fundamentally changed by any of it. From the outside, it was beautiful in the particular way of things that have simply lasted. A little worn at the corners, very settled in its bones. The grounds stretched away in all directions and lost themselves in the dark. Out there somewhere was the formal garden with its long reflecting lake, the kitchen gardens, the chapel at the far end of the formal garden's central axis, where tomorrow's ceremony would take place, and the woodland that Edmund had described to her 2 months ago in London, over a dinner, where he had done the unusual thing of talking about his childhood, with obvious affection and very little performance. She thought about Edmund. This was a deliberate act. She was choosing to think about him now because he was solid ground, and she needed solid ground under her. She had been doing it since she met him. When things were uncertain or strange or more complicated than they appeared, she thought about what she knew of him and what she had concluded about him, and she let the thinking stabilize her. He was not a dramatic person. He did not perform himself. He did not talk to be heard or fill silence to avoid it. He listened with the kind of attention that meant, when he asked a question, he had actually been paying attention to everything said before it. He noticed things about Charlotte that other people did not notice because other people were not actually looking. He had learned, over the months of their courtship, that she preferred mornings over evenings, that she found large gatherings exhausting, for reasons that had nothing to do with shyness, that she did not like being introduced to new situations without some information about them in advance, and that she had a particular kind of quietness she went into when she was working through a problem that looked from the outside like ordinary composure, but was in fact something much more engaged. He had learned all of this without being told, and he had never used any of it except to be thoughtful. She trusted him. She was going to hold on to that now, in the way of holding on to something that is genuinely solid when everything else is slightly uncertain. But the trust she had in Edmund was a trust she had in Edmund as a person, in who he was when you knew him. It was not, and had never pretended to be, a trust that extended automatically to everything he had come from, to the house and the family, and the long history of both. Old families carried old things. She had known that from the beginning of their courtship. She had thought she was prepared for it. What she had not been prepared for was scissors in the night, and a locket already open, and a lock of silver hair wrapped in folded white cloth. She set the empty glass back on the side table and walked to her room. Clara was asleep. Charlotte did not wake her. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, fully dressed, still in her nightrobe, and applied her mind to the situation with the same methodical care her father had spent years teaching her to use on situations that resisted easy explanation. She was 26, the elder daughter of a country solicitor and a woman who had been a schoolteacher before her marriage and, in all the ways that actually mattered, had never stopped being one. Her childhood had been comfortable without being grand, eventful without being dramatic, and instructive in the particular ways that leave permanent marks. Her mother had taught her to read carefully and to understand that the way a sentence was arranged changed the sentence's meaning as much as the words themselves did. Her father had taught her that when something in a document confused her, the confusion was information. It meant something, it pointed somewhere, and her job was to follow the pointing, rather than to smooth the confusion over and pretend it was not there. She followed the pointing now. One lock of hair, from a specific position on the left side of the head, behind the ear, 3 inches long, wrapped in white cloth that had been folded in advance, placed in a locket that had been open and waiting. The maid assigned to this task alone, young, precise, clearly prepared for exactly what was required of her. Eleanor's complete absence of surprise at being observed, the measuring look in the mirror, the warning underneath the calm, and the thing Charlotte's mind returned to most insistently. The locket had been prepared in advance, open, and waiting on the vanity. This was not something the Duchess had decided to do that evening and arranged on the spot. Someone had prepared a surface. Someone had laid out a white cloth. Someone had opened the locket and positioned it and had a young maid waiting with silver scissors. You did not prepare things in advance for something casual. You prepared things in advance for something that was going to happen, at a specific time in a specific way, regardless of anything else. You prepared things in advance for an obligation. She lay back on the bed and looked up at the dark ceiling. She thought about Harriet's remark that afternoon, the one she had not fully processed at the time, because there had been no reason yet to give it more than passing attention. They had been walking through the entrance hall, and Charlotte had stopped in front of a small, silver-framed portrait on a side table at the foot of the staircase. It showed a young woman in early 19th century dress, her expression composed in the particular way of someone who has cultivated composure as a practice, rather than being born to it. Charlotte had asked who she was. Harriet had looked at the portrait for a moment, with an expression that Charlotte had registered, but not yet been able to classify. My grandmother, she had said. The second Duchess. She came here as a young woman of 20 and had a very long and very complicated life. A brief pause. My mother keeps that portrait in precisely that spot. It has always been there, as long as I can remember. I never thought to ask why until I was old enough to suspect the answer might not be a simple one. At the time, it had seemed like the kind of remark families made about old photographs, slightly wistful, slightly opaque, carrying the residue of things that had been decided not to discuss. Charlotte had filed it and moved on. Now it opened. Old enough to suspect the answer might not be a simple one. She closed her eyes. Sleep came eventually, long after midnight, thin and fitful, and easily disturbed by the sounds of the old house settling around her, the particular language of timber and stone that very old buildings speak in the deepest part of the night, contracting in the dark, adjusting to temperatures and pressures with small patient sounds that were completely ordinary, and nevertheless would not let you quite forget that you were in a place with a long memory. She lay in that thin sleep and thought about what she had seen and what she was going to do about it, and sometime before dawn she arrived, not at answers, but at questions that were clear enough and specific enough to pursue. In the morning, she was going to marry Edmund. That was settled and that was right, and she did not need to revisit it. But she was also going to find out what she had seen and what it meant, and whether there were people who had known what it meant for years and had chosen not to tell her. The morning light came in pale and patient through the tall windows. Charlotte was already awake when it arrived. She lay still for a moment and listened to the house beginning its day beneath her. A door somewhere far below opening and closing with brisk purpose. The muffled direction of one voice and the acknowledgement of another. The careful sound of something being carried along a ground-floor corridor. The ordinary sounds of a large household that had work to do and was doing it. Outside, a bird was singing, with complete indifference to the weight of the day. Charlotte sat up. She pressed her feet to the cold floorboards and held herself straight and still for a moment, gathering everything she was going to need. She needed 4 things. Edmund, alone, before the ceremony began. The truth of what she had seen last night. The patience to hear whatever was told to her, without deciding in advance what to make of it. And enough steadiness to walk to the end of that garden afterward, and mean every word she said. She was fairly confident she had all 4. She reached for the small bell on the bedside table, and rang it once for Clara. The hall moved with the particular energy of a house that had been given a large task and was performing it. The flower deliveries had started before dawn. Charlotte could hear the arrivals even before Clara knocked to begin the morning preparations. The low, purposeful voices of the florists in the entrance hall below, and the careful sounds of fragile things being carried with professional intention. Through the window, the formal garden lay in the early morning light with the composed perfection of something arranged by people who understood what was being arranged for. The lawns were cut, the box hedges squared, the path to the chapel at the far end of the garden swept and clear and ready. The sky was pale blue in the specific, cooperative way of skies that seemed to have been produced for the occasion. Charlotte sat at the dressing table and let Clara work, and thought about what she needed from this morning. She needed 5 minutes with Edmund before the ceremony. Just 5. She was not going to demand the full explanation in 5 minutes on the morning of her wedding, because she was a practical person and understood that there were moments that could not be extended without damaging everything around them. What she needed from Edmund this morning was a confirmation. She needed to see his face when she said what she had seen, and to understand from his expression whether he knew what it was and had made the decision not to tell her about it. She suspected he knew. Her evidence for this was circumstantial but coherent. The ritual she had watched through the door was clearly not new, not improvised, not the spontaneous act of a single woman on a single night. It had the form of something long established, which meant it had been part of this family for long enough that a man who had grown up in this family and paid any attention at all to it would know of it. But suspicion was not knowledge, and Charlotte had too much respect for the difference between them to proceed as though they were the same thing. Mrs. Pemberton knocked at 7:45, precisely, entering when invited, with a small arrangement of lily of the valley from the kitchen garden, the stems cut to a consistent length, the white bells arranged with the same quiet precision that characterized everything the housekeeper did. She set them on the windowsill with the brief explanation that they had been cut that morning and would hold through the day. Then she stood with her hands clasped, her posture as it always was, and asked whether Charlotte had slept well. "Well enough," Charlotte said, watching Mrs. Pemberton's reflection in the dressing mirror. "How long have you been with the family, Mrs. Pemberton?" 41 years, the housekeeper said, a fact offered without inflation or diminishment. "I came as a housemaid at 16. The late Duke was still alive then. And Duchess Eleanor has been at the Hall since her marriage? She came as a bride at 22, so I had been here 6 years before her, in a technical sense, though that distinction would not have been visible from anyone's perspective." A pause, not long, not dramatic, but unmistakably considered. "She has been a thorough and devoted mistress of the house." Charlotte set down the hairpin she had been holding, and turned slightly in her chair to look at the housekeeper directly. "Does the family have any customs that belong specifically to them? Things that would not appear in other households, particular to the Ashcombs?" The pause before Mrs. Pemberton's response was approximately half a second longer than reflection alone required. Not long enough to be noticed by someone who was not watching for it. Charlotte was watching for it. "Every family of long standing has its particular customs," the housekeeper said, with the precision of someone selecting each word carefully. "The Ashcombs are no different in that respect." "Of course," Charlotte said pleasantly, and turned back to the mirror. Mrs. Pemberton set down the small pair of scissors she had been adjusting in the flower arrangement, excused herself with a quiet nod, and went out. The door closed with the same unhurried care with which it had opened. Clara continued. Charlotte looked at her own reflection, and thought about the housekeeper's pause, and what a woman with 41 years of experience, and the clear intelligence, to have been running a house of this size, for most of them, chose not to say, when she was asked a direct question. Harriet arrived at 8 o'clock. She had the manner of a woman who had grown up in this house, and retained a private familiarity with its spaces. She came in without the slight hesitation that most people show on entering someone else's room, and she sat in the chair near the fireplace, with the ease of someone sitting in a space they have occupied many times before. She looked at Charlotte the way she always looked at her, with actual attention, seeing what was there, rather than what was expected to be there. "You have been awake for a long time," Harriet said, "since before 4. Working something out." "Yes." Harriet laced her fingers together in her lap and waited with the patience of someone who has spent her life surrounded by people who said important things slowly, and had learned that patience was the only useful response to this. Charlotte set down the ribbon Clara had handed her and looked at Harriet in the mirror. "Last night I was in the east corridor after 10 o'clock, she said. "Your mother's door was not fully closed. I watched a maid, Agnes I think, cut a lock of your mother's hair and put it inside a silver locket. The maid had been brought in specifically for the task. The locket was open on the vanity, already waiting. There was a white cloth, folded in advance. The whole thing was prepared." Harriet looked at the fire. Then she said, "Ah." "Just ah?" "I have been waiting," Harriet said slowly, "since yesterday afternoon, when I first had the chance to observe you properly, to see how quickly you would arrive at the question. I thought it might be this morning." She was quiet for a moment. "I should say what my mother would want me to say, which is that it is perfectly ordinary, a very old tradition, harmless as anything you might name. But I have never been good at saying what my mother wants me to say. What will you say instead?" Harriet looked at the fire for another moment. When she spoke, her tone had the quality of something thought through carefully, not said quickly. "There is a version of what you saw that is entirely harmless. An old custom, with a real history behind it, connected to something genuine, doing no harm to anyone. That is almost certainly the accurate version. I believe it to be." She paused. "Almost certainly. And the version where the almost carries something. The same act, but where the meaning has been separated from the act over time," Harriet said. "And an act without its meaning is not the same as an act with it. It is stranger. It is harder to carry comfortably. And the people who know the meaning, and the people who do not know it, are not living in the same house, even when they share the same walls." She looked up from the fire, and met Charlotte's eyes in the mirror. "Edmund knows more than I know. He was told more, because he was the one who was going to need it. Ask him directly and clearly, before the ceremony. He cannot deceive someone he loves. It is the quality of his, I have always found simultaneously admirable and exhausting." She stood up and went to the window. Below, the garden was already receiving the first guests' carriages. The sound of hooves on gravel drifting up faintly. "I have known about this my whole life," she said quietly. Since before I was old enough to understand that knowing about something and understanding it were different things. And in all that time, I have never believed that the women who married into this family should be kept in the dark about it. It was never right. It has become less right with every generation that has passed it forward without explanation. She turned from the window. I think you are the person who is going to do something about that. She went to the door. Talk to Edmund, she said, and hold on to the fact that he loves you. It is the true thing, and it matters more than all the rest of it. Charlotte found Edmund at the far edge of the lawn at 9:30, in the gap between his dressing and the arrival of the first guests. He stood looking toward the chapel with the quality of attention of someone marking time before something significant. He turned when he heard her cross the gravel path, and his face did what it always did when she came into his line of sight. The same involuntary settling, the same specific warmth that he appeared entirely unable to prevent and had given up trying to. You look extraordinary, he said quietly. Edmund. She stopped in front of him. Last night, I was in the east corridor after 10. Your mother's door was not fully closed. I watched Agnes cut a lock of your mother's hair and place it in a silver locket. The locket was open and waiting on the vanity. There was white cloth that had been prepared in advance. Tell me what that is. The change in him was immediate and specific. Not guilt in the simple sense, something more layered. The dread of a man who has known for a long time that a particular moment was approaching and had not, in all that time, landed on the right response to it. He looked toward the chapel, then back at her. It is a family tradition, he said. Very old. I give you my word, it is not harmful. I did not ask whether it was harmful, Charlotte said, without any pressure in her voice. I asked what it is. I know. He held her gaze. Something moved in his expression, the beginning and the abandonment of several things before he arrived at what he was actually going to say. I will tell you everything tonight, every piece of it. That is a genuine promise. She looked at him for a long moment. She could see he was not deceiving her. She could also see that he was choosing an evening over a morning for reasons that were real to him, and that the reasons were not entirely without merit even from where she stood. She could push. She could insist. She could stand here in the garden 40 minutes before her wedding and demand it all right now. She did not do any of those things. Tonight, she said. Tonight, he said. I'm sorry. She nodded once and turned back toward the house. Behind her, she heard the long, careful breath of someone who has come through something and knows they have not entirely come through it. Inside, the butler George was directing 2 footmen near the entrance with the quiet, total authority of someone who has been performing this function for decades and requires no raised voice. As Charlotte passed, he stepped aside with his customary deference. Then, as she reached the first stair, he said, not to her, not to the footman, but to the general air of the entrance hall, as though making an observation about the weather. The hall has not had a morning like this in many years. Let us hope it goes well for everyone. Charlotte's hand paused on the banister. She looked back. George was attending to the footman with complete absorption, his face expressing nothing beyond professional focus. Let us hope it goes well for everyone. She went upstairs. Through the window at the landing, the chapel sat at the end of the garden path in its old stone and ivy, solid and patient, as it had been for every occasion it had received in 300 years. She looked at it for a moment. Then she went to finish getting ready for her wedding. She was shown to her room at 4:30. She had barely set down her small travel case when Clara knocked. Clara had arrived ahead with the luggage and the practical arrangements, and had the room ordered already. The dresses hung, the dressing table set, a small vase of flowers from the kitchen garden placed on the windowsill, without being asked, because Clara understood that Charlotte was the kind of person who required small, real things in a new space in order to feel oriented within it. Charlotte had changed out of her traveling clothes and gone down to meet the family for tea and then for dinner. And through all of it, she had been gathering impressions the way she gathered impressions anywhere new. Quietly, continuously, without making it visible. Edmund had watched her watching and had said, at one point during dinner, very quietly so only she could hear, "You are tallying." Which she was, and the accuracy of his observation was one of the things she found most comfortable about him. He saw her clearly. She had tested this many times, over many months, and he continued to see her accurately, without editing what he saw into a more convenient version. She had decided this was the quality that mattered most. Mrs. Pemberton, by the time the hall was settled into its nighttime quiet, and Charlotte was in the east corridor with the water glass in her hand, had been at Ashcombe Hall for longer than Charlotte had been alive. 41 years was not a number she had said with any particular weight to it. It was simply the number of years, offered plainly. But Charlotte, standing in the corridor with the water glass and the sound of scissors beyond the door, thought about what 41 years of proximity to a family looked like from the inside. You saw things, you understood things, you learned what to say and what not to say, and you learned the difference between the things that were discussed and the things that were understood by everyone and discussed by no one. Mrs. Pemberton's pause on the word customs was one of the latter. Charlotte filed it carefully. Through the window at the end of the corridor, the grounds of Ashcombe Hall lay dark and extensive. She had walked some of them that afternoon with Edmund, the formal garden, the path to the chapel, the lake. And she had understood from that walk something she had suspected but not verified. The estate was a world. Not merely a large property, but a complete, self-contained world with its own interior rules and its own particular gravity. The kind of weight that accumulated in a place when many generations of the same family had lived and worked and died in it, and left their particular quality of inhabitation behind them. That weight was not threatening. It was simply present, the way old things are present, undeniably, composedly, without any urgency about whether you were aware of it. Through the window at the end of the corridor, the chapel sat at the bottom of the formal garden path, with its old stone and its ivy, and the particular stillness of buildings that have stood long enough in one place to have stopped caring what the weather brings. Charlotte had walked that path, that morning. She was going to walk it again in less than 2 hours. The thought had a quality of both enormity and ordinariness that she had not quite been prepared for, that the most significant moment of her life thus far was going to happen in a building she could see from this window, on a path she could see from this window, in weather that was going to be whatever it was going to be, regardless of the importance of the occasion. She went upstairs. She thought, climbing the stairs, about the quality of Edmund's evasion that morning in the garden. It had not been dishonest. She was certain of that. Edmund did not have the specific quality of a person who lied, which was a quality you could develop an eye for if you spent enough time around people who did. His evasion had been something else. The evasion of someone choosing a when over a whether, choosing the evening over the morning. Not because the evening was more convenient, but because the evening was, in his judgment, better. She did not know yet whether the judgment was correct. She would form a view on that when she knew what the thing was, and what the correct moment for telling her would have been. For now, she had to get ready to be married. Clara was waiting. The room was warm from the fire, and the morning light was full and clear through the tall windows, and outside the garden was laid out in its September best, the hedges squared, the paths clean, the chapel at the far end receiving the light exactly as it had received every other morning in 300 years of receiving light. Charlotte sat down and let Clara begin, and thought about what the day was going to be. The chapel at the end of the formal garden had been standing for 300 years, and received occasions the way old stone receives everything, with an equanimity that comes from having outlasted a great deal, and an indifference to what anyone expects of it. The walls were original stone, dark with centuries of the patient damp that ivy keeps against exterior surfaces, and the narrow high windows admitted the specific pale, cool light of enclosed stone spaces, the kind that makes the present moment and the long past feel simultaneous. The smell inside was candle wax and old wood, and the particular mineral quality of a floor that has been walked on, in this place, for 300 years of particular occasions. 60 guests in the dark oak pews. Edmund at the front, his back to the door, not yet turned. Charlotte's Uncle Leonard had said one thing on the garden path. He had squeezed her hand without preamble and said, "You are certain?" She had said, "Entirely." That had been all. He was not a man who required more words than a situation required, which was one of the things Charlotte had always valued in him. Edmund turned. He always turned the same way when Charlotte came into a room he was already in, not with the performed announcement of someone who has decided to make a moment of it, but the way a compass needle finds north, which is simply what it does, without effort or deliberation. He looked at her from the front of the chapel in the pale morning light, and 60 people, and 3 centuries of occasion receded to the edges of the room. She walked toward him and was aware, without looking directly, of Eleanor in the front right pew. Peripheral awareness was adequate. The Duchess sat with her customary immaculate posture in silver gray, her expression composed and entirely appropriate for a mother watching her son be married. But Charlotte could see, from this angle, the direction of the Duchess's gaze, and it was not Edmund. It moved across the room and found Charlotte on the walk down the aisle and settled there, with the specific quality of someone who is watching to see whether a particular thing will happen and has staked something important on the result. Not hostility, not judgment of the ordinary kind. Evaluation. The careful, evidence-gathering attention of someone who needs to know something and is watching for the answer. Charlotte reached the front and stood beside Edmund, and he turned fully toward her, and the ceremony began. She was fully present for it. She had decided that she was going to be fully present for it, and she was. She stood in the stone chapel in the pale light, and listened to every word spoken, and participated in every part of what was asked of her, and meant all of it. This was her choice, made deliberately and completely, and she was not going to let anything diminish the completeness of it. But she was also watching Eleanor. Not staring. She did not turn her head, did not make it visible. Peripheral attention, the kind she had cultivated over years of needing to monitor more than one thing at once. At the pauses in the service, at the intervals, at the specific spaces between one thing and another that a ceremony creates, Charlotte caught the quality of Eleanor's gaze, and each time it was the same, steady, measuring, directed at Charlotte, with the particular attention of someone who is forming a conclusion from evidence. Edmund spoke his vows. He spoke them in the way he spoke everything that genuinely mattered to him, without decoration, without theatrical pause, without any attempt to perform the feeling for the benefit of the audience witnessing it. He spoke them the way you speak a thing that is simply true, clearly, directly, with the steady voice of someone who has already thought about this many times in private, and is now saying in public what has long been decided. He looked at Charlotte while he said them, and did not look anywhere else, and his voice did not waver, and the specific warmth in his expression was not performed. Charlotte felt something settle in her chest, not surprise, because she had known who he was for long enough now to have an accurate picture of him. Confirmation. The particular feeling of something already believed being proved true in front of witnesses. She spoke her own vows. Her voice was clear and even in the stone chapel, and she meant every word of them completely, and she held Edmund's gaze while she said them, and the old chapel received them as it had received every occasion that had come through its door in 300 years, with patient, impersonal permanence. The guests moved from the chapel, back across the garden to the hall in the pleasant September morning, and the hall revealed what it could do when a proper occasion was brought to it. The rooms had been transformed during the ceremony hours. Flowers on every surface, white roses and trailing greenery, and something delicate and pale that Charlotte had no name for, in the abundant, slightly unreal profusion of expert arrangement. Every candle lit. The light in the reception rooms, warm and layered in the way of a house performing its best version of itself, not from pretension, but from the natural result of 3 centuries of knowing how to receive people well. Charlotte moved through the reception. She greeted people, and received their kindnesses, and thanked them for what they said. She talked to Edmund's loud, well-meaning school friend Henry, who clearly liked Edmund very much, and expressed this by saying so frequently. She talked to her own friend Dorothy from London, who had known Charlotte for 20 years, and said, with the directness of that long friendship, "You look right." "I thought you would." She ate a little. She drank a single glass of champagne. Eleanor moved through the reception on a different trajectory, not avoiding Charlotte. This would have been too visible, too obviously managed. The Duchess's skill was more refined than avoidance. She moved through the reception in a pattern that crossed Charlotte's path at the correct social intervals, acknowledged her with the warmth appropriate to a mother-in-law at her son's wedding, and then continued. But at no point in 2 hours did they have a conversation beyond the few necessary sentences. Eleanor was controlling the timing of something, and Charlotte could see it clearly enough now to understand that the control itself was a form of communication. At 6:30, Edmund's cousin Clara, a pleasant, somewhat anxious woman of 40, who had been designated the family's social manager for the occasion, called for the family toasts. Harriet went first. She was brief and warm and dry, in the precise proportion that made her words land. and when the room laughed at the two moments that deserved laughter, it was genuine laughter rather than polite performance. Then Eleanor rose. The room quieted. It quieted not because people were asked to be quiet, but because Eleanor standing had a quality to it, a combination of posture and stillness, and the particular presence of someone whose words in rooms like this had always been listened to, that made quiet the natural response. "My son," Eleanor said, "has chosen a woman who does not accept things at face value." The guests produced an appreciative sound. Eleanor acknowledged it with a smile that was real, without being broad. "I observe this not merely as a compliment, but as a statement about what this marriage will in fact be, which I expect will be more interesting and more consequential than most." She paused. Charlotte asks questions. She looks behind the surface of things to see what holds them up. She does not settle into comfort with something she has not yet understood, and she does not stop investigating, simply because the investigation becomes inconvenient, or because those around her would prefer she did. A pause. Charlotte could feel Eleanor's gaze finding her across the room. "What we carry in this family is old, and sometimes heavy, as things of real age and long standing always are," Eleanor continued. "Every family has its particular weight. The question is never whether such things exist, but how they are carried, and by whom, and with what willingness to understand their true nature, rather than simply their inherited form." She paused one final time, and the last sentence landed with the weight of something said for a specific audience within the general one. "I can think of no one I would more trust to carry this one with more honesty than it has sometimes been carried before." She raised her glass. The room raised its glasses. Charlotte raised hers and met Eleanor's eyes across the candlelit room, and heard the second sentence that ran through every word of that toast. Unmistakable. Once you understood the landscape it was crossing. More honesty than it has sometimes been carried before. Edmund danced with Charlotte twice. The first time she let the dance be simply itself. His hand, the music, the particular quality of being in the same room with the person you have chosen, and knowing you have chosen correctly. She needed that, and she took it deliberately. The second time, she said quietly, with the music covering her voice, "Your mother's toast." He said, "Yes." Every sentence had a second meaning underneath the first. He was quiet for a measure of the music. "She is a layered person. She always has been." Edmund. His hand on her back tightened slightly. "Not much, just enough. Tonight," he said, "I give you my word." She let it rest. Near the fireplace at the far end of the main reception room, at around 8 o'clock in the evening, Charlotte was crossing between two groups when a small, elderly woman caught her arm. Edmund's great-aunt Dorothy, a woman of 82, who had been sharp for every one of those years and showed no sign of softening, peered up at Charlotte with bright, direct eyes that had not dimmed with anything the decades had brought to them. "Just like her mother," she said, without any preamble. "I told Eleanor so when she showed me the photograph, last spring. I knew it the moment you walked into that chapel this morning. The way you carry yourself, the way you actually look at things, instead of past them." She leaned in, very slightly. "It's in the eyes, you know. You can always see it in the eyes." Charlotte said, "I beg your pardon, like whose mother exactly?" But Edmund's large, affable cousin Geoffrey appeared at Dorothy's elbow with the smooth, practiced efficiency of someone who had been given a specific instruction and had been waiting attentively for the moment to execute it. "Aunt Dorothy," he said, warmly and firmly, "Lady Hadstock has been looking for you for the past half hour. She's in the drawing room and wants a few minutes. Come and say hello." He placed a gentle and entirely firm hand beneath Dorothy's elbow and steered her away across the room. Dorothy still talking, still gesturing, her voice fading into the general noise of the reception, before Charlotte could ask the question again. Charlotte stood where she was for a moment. Then she looked across the room. Edmund was 20 feet away, watching her. He had seen all of it. Dorothy's arrival, the partial sentence, Geoffrey's appearance and redirection, Charlotte standing in the wake of it. His face carried an expression she had not seen on him before that evening. The tired, slightly worn expression of someone who has been managing something large for a long time, and is discovering that the effort is becoming more difficult to conceal than it used to be. Just like her mother. Like whose mother? The last guests departed after 10. The hall accepted their going, with the composed dignity of a house that has absorbed many large occasions and knows the specific quality of the quiet that follows them. Staff moved through the rooms in the quiet tide of reclaiming the space, collecting, restoring, returning the rooms to their everyday dimensions. Edmund went to see off the last of the family. Charlotte stood at the foot of the staircase and looked at the small, silver-framed portrait of the second Duchess on the side table. Old enough to suspect the answer might not be simple. She went upstairs to wait for Edmund and the explanation he had promised. He was delayed. Clara brought word that an urgent boundary matter had detained him with the estate manager, a collapsed fence, a dispute with the neighboring property that could not safely wait until morning. He sent his sincere apologies and expected to be free within the hour. Charlotte thanked Clara, sent her to bed, and sat alone in her new room. After a few minutes, she stood up, took her lamp, and went to see what else this house was willing to tell her. Charlotte had stood in the entrance hall of Ashcombe Hall for a moment, before walking out to the garden path to meet Leonard. She had stood under the high ceiling and looked at the proportions of the space, the staircase, the portraits on the upper walls, the old stone floor that had received the weight of many significant occasions, and she had thought, I am about to become part of this, not merely a guest or a visitor, or a woman who was staying here for a time. Part of it. Part of the line of women who had stood in this entrance hall and known they were standing at the threshold of something permanent. The feeling was not frightening. It was interesting, in the specific way that things are interesting when you have thought about them carefully and arrived at a clear-eyed understanding of what they are. She had thought about what it meant to marry into an old family. She had understood it in the abstract, and she was beginning to understand it in the particular, and the particular was larger than the abstract, in the way that things always are when they become concrete. In the chapel, she had registered everything, the stone walls and the pale light and the smell of old wood and candle wax, the small congregation in the dark pews, the quiet before the organ began. She had taken all of it in because she was the kind of person who took things in, who believed that paying attention to the world around her was both a courtesy and a form of respect, and because she understood that occasions like this one happened only once, and that you could not go back and receive it again if you had not been present for it the first time. And she had been present for it, fully, genuinely present. This was a choice she had made before she walked through the door, and she had maintained it throughout. Whatever questions were in her mind, whatever she was holding alongside the ceremony in the other hand, she had not let it take her out of the moment she was in. Edmund's vows had given her something she had not expected, not confirmation of something she had doubted, but a deepening of something she had already known. She had known who he was. She had been certain of her choice. But hearing him say the words, plainly, steadily, with his eyes on her and nothing performed in it, had made the knowing different, made it more physical, more present, more real, in the specific way that public declaration makes private certainty real. She thought about that now, standing in the evening reception with her champagne glass, and the sound of the orchestra from the drawing room, and the warm light of the hall, at its most dressed, and its most beautiful. Whatever she was going to have to understand about this family, and this house, and the thing that lived in the space between what people knew and what they told each other, whatever work that was going to require, she was going to do it from here, from this place of knowing, and of having been known, and of having declared both of those things in front of witnesses in an old stone chapel at the end of a garden path on a clear September morning. That was a solid place to stand. The portrait gallery ran the full length of the north corridor on the first floor, a long, narrow room that some previous Ashcombe in some previous century had fitted with dark wood paneling and hung from end to end with canvases that tracked the family across more than 200 years. Charlotte came in from the corridor end and pulled the door closed behind her and raised her lamp. The room was cool and carried the combined smell of old canvas, oil varnish, and the dry mineral quality that comes from stone walls behind wood panels, no matter how long ago the panels were fixed. The lamp moved slightly as she walked, and the light moved across the paintings with it, lifting the lower faces into warmth and dropping the higher ones into partial shadow, so that the figures in the upper registers seemed to lean slightly forward in the dark, curious about the person with the light. She began at the near end. The earliest portraits were of the men, a succession of dukes going back to the early 1700s, painted in the formal, slightly stiff poses that official portraiture required of them, men accustomed to action and decision, seated perfectly still while someone made a record of them, and not always comfortable with the experience. She looked at each of them briefly, noting names on the small plaques below the frames, noting dates, noting the specific quality of expression that each painter had captured or failed to capture, and moved on. Then the women began to appear. First among the men, wives in smaller canvases placed between the larger ones, their presence acknowledged rather than featured. Then more substantially, as the gallery moved into the 19th century, until the far half of the room gave them their own sequence, the duchesses, in pairs. Each woman appearing twice, a bridal portrait from early in the marriage, formal and youthful, and a later portrait from years or decades further on. The same woman settled into the life she had built here. Charlotte slowed. She was not yet entirely certain what she was looking for, only that she was looking, and that looking carefully at things was the only reliable method she had. She stood before the first pair of double portraits, and gave them the same quality of attention she gave to anything she needed to understand. Complete, patient, not yet analytical. Taking in what was there. The first portrait showed a dark-haired woman, of perhaps 25, in the style of the early 1800s, the hair full and elaborately arranged in the fashion of the period, high and dressed with the considered formality of a woman who understood that her portrait would be formal and had arranged herself accordingly. The second portrait showed her perhaps 15 years later, the same face, same dark eyes, same particular quality of presence. Older, in the specific way that people who have lived their lives fully become older. The hair styled differently, naturally, across 15 years of changing fashion. But Charlotte raised the lamp closer and tilted it so the light fell at an angle across the canvas surface. The difference was very small, almost invisible without a reason to see it. The hair above the left ear in the bridal portrait was as full and elaborate as the rest of the arrangement, consistent with the whole, symmetric. In the later portrait, in precisely that location, the hair sat differently, a barely perceptible reduction in its volume, an almost undetectable inconsistency in the way it was arranged, as though there was very slightly less of it there than there was everywhere else. The kind of difference you would attribute, without a thought, to a change in styling preference across 15 years, or to the natural thinning that comes with age. You would not see it at all unless you were looking for it, and you would only be looking for it if you had already seen something that made you think it might be there. She moved to the next pair. The second duchess, fair-haired, the expression of someone who has spent a long time presenting herself carefully in public, every element of the face practiced and composed. The bridal portrait showed her hair in the full, balanced arrangement of her era. The later portrait showed her 20 years on, the hair lighter, with the threads of gray that age brings. Charlotte raised the lamp to the left side, above the ear. The same thing, a barely perceptible difference between the two canvases, in the same specific location. The later portrait's hair above the left ear sat fractionally thinner, fractionally different in its texture, than the hair in the bridal portrait. Still arranged, still immaculate. Simply, slightly less, in a specific place. She did not pause. She went to the third pair, the fourth, the fifth. 5 women. 5 generations. The same barely perceptible difference, in the same exact position on the left side of the head, above the ear, between the bridal portrait and the later portrait of the same woman, across what she estimated to be more than a century of canvases, painted by different painters, in different periods, in different styles. Different painters, different women, different eras. The same tiny specific, consistent variation, in the same location in every pair. Charlotte stood in the middle of the gallery, between the paintings on both sides, and held the lamp steady, and let the full weight of what she was seeing settle into its place in her understanding. This was not Eleanor, not something of 2 or 3 generations. This ran back through at least 5 generations of women in this house, back far enough that whoever had first done it had had children who did it, and those children had had children who did it, and those children had had children, and every one of them had sat in a chair before a mirror the night before her wedding, and allowed a lock of hair to be taken from the left side above the ear. And the painters who came to make their official records had recorded it, without knowing they were recording it. In the specific way that portraiture records everything, not what is presented, but what is there. She moved to the end of the gallery. A hook was in the wall at the correct height for a portrait canvas. The wallpaper surrounding it was lighter than the wallpaper immediately adjacent. A clean, neat rectangle of slightly preserved color, where years of hanging canvas had shielded the paper from light, while everything around it had received its share. The shape was visible, clear-edged and unmistakable. A canvas had hung here for long enough to leave this exact record of itself, long enough for the difference in the paper to be visible in lamplight. The portrait was not there. On a small wooden shelf, fixed to the wall directly below the hook, a plain silver frame held a printed card. The typeface was institutional, the clean, impersonal face of a record rather than a personal notation. Margaret, Duchess of Ashcombe. Married the 3rd Duke, 1845. No death date, no information about what had become of her. No portrait, no face, no presence in the sequence at all except this card and the rectangular absence of the canvas that had once hung above it. Charlotte stood in front of that empty space for a long time. The lamp cast its small warm circle. Beyond it, the gallery was dark, the paintings of the Ashcombe women on either side looking out from their frames at nothing in particular, as they had been looking for longer than anyone currently alive in this house could verify. 5 pairs of bridal and later portraits, each showing the same barely perceptible difference in the left side of the hair above the ear, and at the end of the row, a hook on a wall, a faded shadow in the paper, a name, a date, and no face. She reached out and placed the flat of her palm against the wallpaper beside the empty hook, at the edge of the preserved rectangle. Just touched it. The wall was cold. She held her hand there for a moment, then she lowered it and stood with her lamp, looking at the card and the name on it, and thought about what it meant, that this woman was here only as a name, that whatever had happened in this house to Margaret Ashcombe, the result of it was this: a hook, a shadow, and a printed record of a marriage, with no further record of anything that followed. She turned and walked the full length of the gallery back to the door. The painted faces passed on either side of her in the lamplight. The Ashcombe women in their bridal years, and in their later years, generation after generation, all of them carrying that one specific, barely visible difference in the same location. The painter in each case, having recorded faithfully what was there, without knowing what they were recording. Charlotte came out into the north corridor and stood for a moment, looking toward the staircase. Margaret Ashcombe. Married the 3rd Duke, 1845. No portrait. No death date. A hook on a wall and a faded rectangular shadow where something used to be. She went back to the marital chambers, and she opened the writing desk. She had gone into the gallery not expecting to find anything specific. She had gone in because she needed to think, and because moving through spaces gave her thinking a shape and a direction that sitting still did not always manage to provide. The gallery had been the obvious choice. A long room, private at this hour, full of the accumulated evidence of the family's long history. She had thought she might walk through it and feel the weight of the place more fully, might understand something about what she had entered by looking at the people who had entered it before her. She had not expected the portraits to give her information. The thing about information that came from careful looking was that it changed the quality of what you saw next. Once she had seen the difference in the first pair of portraits, once she had identified the barely perceptible variation above the left ear in the later canvas versus the bridal canvas, she saw it in every subsequent pair with increasing clarity and certainty. The first sighting had required effort and close attention, and the benefit of the lamplight at a specific angle. By the 4th pair, she could have identified the variation from a normal viewing distance. It was there. It was consistent. It had been painted by different painters working in different periods in different artistic styles, and they had all recorded it because they had all painted what was in front of them, and what was in front of each of them was a woman whose hair had been altered in a specific and consistent way, in a specific and consistent location. Charlotte walked back through the gallery, slowly on her way out, holding the lamp up as she went. She looked at each woman a second time, not for the details she had already found, but for the whole of them, the way they had arranged themselves for their portraits, the expressions they had chosen to present to the painters, or that the painters had captured despite their choices, the specific quality of their presence in the canvases, which, in the case of painted portraits, was partly the subject and partly the painter, and always something produced between the two. They were all, in their way, present. Even the ones who had been painted in the stilted conventions of their era, even the ones whose expressions gave away little, had a quality of being there that good portraiture produced, a sense that here was a person who had stood in this world and made decisions and carried things, and left their mark in the form of this image, which outlasted them, and would continue to outlast them for as long as the canvas held together. 5 of them, across what she estimated to be more than 120 years, with the same barely perceptible difference in the same location, in the left side of the hair above the ear. 5 women who had done what they had been asked to do, or what they had chosen to do when given the full understanding of what they were doing, and had had it recorded in their portraits, without any of them having agreed to that recording. The portraits had simply captured what was there. And at the end of the row, one woman who was not there. Charlotte stood in front of the empty hook one more time before she left the gallery. She stood there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, which was a thing she sometimes permitted herself when a situation required it. She looked at the printed card in its plain frame, and the name on it, and the date, and the blank space where more information should have been. Margaret, Duchess of Ashcombe, married the 3rd Duke, 1845. No portrait, no further dates, no record of what had happened to her, where she had gone, what she had become in the years after she left this house. Only the beginning of her connection to the family, preserved in institutional print, and the empty wall above it, where her face should have been. Charlotte thought, I am going to know your full name. I am going to find out what happened to you, and what it meant, and what should have been different. And when I know it, I am going to make sure it cannot happen again. She went out of the gallery and into the corridor, and along to her room. She stood in the gallery's quiet for a moment, after she had finished examining the portraits, and before she began walking back. The room was entirely still. The hall was entirely still around it. Somewhere outside the building, somewhere in the grounds, an owl called once and then fell silent, which was the kind of thing that happened in the country at night, and was nothing. She stood in the quiet, and let herself receive the full weight of what she had seen. 5 women across a century who had done what was asked of them, or what they had chosen to do, which was perhaps the same thing or perhaps not, depending on whether they had been told what they were choosing, and who had had it recorded in paint by painters who had no idea they were recording it. And one woman who was no longer in the gallery at all, whose place in it had been replaced by a card with a minimum of information and an empty wall. She thought about what it meant that the hall's memory was this complete and this particular, that you could walk through it and read, if you knew how to read it, 100 years of a specific private history, that the paintings had been commissioned for one purpose, to record the family, to create a visual archive of who they had been, and had in the process recorded something else entirely, something the family had not intended to preserve. This was, in her experience, how things generally worked. The things that were preserved were rarely the things you intended to preserve. The important things showed up in the edges of the intended things, in the margins of the official record, in the barely perceptible variation in the left side of the hair above the ear, in a painting, where everyone had been looking at the face. She picked up her lamp. The flame had burned down slightly from the hour or more she had spent in the gallery, and the light it cast was slightly warmer and slightly less bright than it had been when she came in. She walked back through the room one final time, past the first portrait, and the second, and the third, and the fourth, and the fifth, past all 5 pairs of women in their bridal and settled years, and past the gap at the end, with the hook and the card and the faded rectangle. She went out into the corridor and stood for a moment with her hand on the door. She had a name now. She had a pattern. She had a gap in a sequence that was otherwise complete, and she had a drawer in a writing desk that she had not yet opened. She went back to the marital chambers. The drawer was not empty. She had not been looking for anything. She had simply sat at the nearest available surface that was not the bed, because her mind was working, and she was not ready to sleep, and the writing desk was the natural choice, an old and well-made piece, with a tambour lid, and a set of small drawers at the back above the writing surface, the kind of desk that is designed for use rather than for appearance. She had pulled the drawer open without any particular intention. In the center of a piece of dark velvet that had been cut to fit the drawer's dimensions, sitting precisely in the middle of the velvet, rather than pushed to a corner or lying at any angle that suggested carelessness, was a silver locket. It was oval, small, with a simple engraved border running along the rim, the same border pattern, the same oval shape, the same scale and quality of workmanship as the one she had watched through the gap in Eleanor's door the night before last. They were not merely similar. If they were not identical, the differences were too small to detect by lamplight. and Charlotte had been looking at things very carefully for the past 2 days. She stood with the drawer open and looked at the locket without touching it. She looked at it the way she looked at things she needed to understand, completely, without hurrying toward a conclusion. The velvet had been cut to size and placed deliberately. It was not loose material but fitted material. Someone had cut it and placed it. The locket was at the exact center of the velvet. The drawer was otherwise entirely empty. This was not something put down and forgotten. This was not something that had drifted to this location through the ordinary entropy of household accumulation. This was an object placed in a specific location, with specific care, by someone who intended it to be here, intended it to be found, by the next person who came to occupy this room. Charlotte lifted the locket from the drawer. It was lighter than its size suggested, lighter than the silver construction should have made it, and cold from sitting in the enclosed space of the drawer for what must have been some considerable time. She held it for a moment in her palm before she opened it. Inside, where a small oval photograph or a curl of preserved hair might ordinarily sit, there was a square of paper, folded many times over, in half, then in half again, and perhaps again after that, until it was as small and compact as could be made, while still remaining recoverable by careful hands. Charlotte unfolded it. The paper was old, not ancient, but specifically old, in the way that paper is when it has been stored undisturbed for a period of decades. The edges had the faint, yellowish tinge of age. The fold lines had become permanent features of the paper's texture, pressed in so thoroughly that they would have remained even if the paper had been spread flat for years. These folds had been the paper's natural state for a very long time. On the inner surface, in handwriting she had not seen before, older in its style, slightly formal, the careful, deliberate script of someone who took time over the shape of their letters and considered writing to be an act that deserved attention, were 2 pieces of information, nothing surrounding them, no salutation, no framing context, no explanatory text of any kind, just, Margaret Ashcombe, November the 4th, 1847. Charlotte read them. She read them again. Then she sat with the unfolded paper in one hand and the locket in the other, and did not move for a considerable time. Margaret Ashcombe. The name on the card in the gallery, beneath the empty hook, beneath the faded rectangular shadow of a canvas, removed without explanation. And a date, November the 4th, 1847, which meant nothing to her without context, but which someone had considered significant enough to write down and preserve inside a locket, inside a writing desk drawer in the marital chambers of Ashcombe Hall. Not hidden, placed. There was a difference, and the difference was important. Hidden things were put somewhere they would not be found. This had been put somewhere specific, in the most likely place to be opened by the next woman who came to this room as its rightful occupant. It was not hidden, it was waiting. She folded the paper along its original lines and replaced it in the locket, and closed the locket and put it in the pocket of her dressing gown. The library was on the ground floor. She had been shown it during that first afternoon's tour, a long, serious room that smelled of books and the particular accumulated scent of papers that have sat undisturbed in the same place for decades. She found it now, through the dark corridors of the hall's nighttime, moving quietly, with the lamp held low, and found a lamp already burning on the center table at a low turn. She raised it and went to the lower shelves on the left side. The estate registers were there, a row of substantial cloth-bound ledgers spanning more than 2 centuries, each labeled on the spine with a range of years, in gilt lettering faded with age. She found the volume for 1840 to 1860 and brought it to the table and sat down. The family section was at the front of each volume, births, marriages, deaths, in the formal compact language of official record-keeping. She found Margaret Ashcombe without much difficulty. The entry was brief. Arrived at Ashcombe Hall as Duchess, June 1845. Below it, a son born to the Duke and Duchess, March 1850, and below that, the Duchess in good health following the confinement. Then household matters, estate entries, the ordinary record of a functioning household. The Duke appeared in further entries. He died in 1851, and his death was properly recorded, the succession noted. Margaret's name did not appear again after the entry for her son's birth. Charlotte went back to the 1850 entry and examined it from a closer distance, angling the lamp at different positions across the page. The main text was consistent, the same hand throughout, the same ink, the same quality of formal record-keeping. But in the left margin, below the entry for the son's birth, in a handwriting entirely different from the rest, and in pencil so faint that she had to hold the lamp at a specific low angle to catch the impressions of the letters in the paper. Departed in the boy's first year. 4 words, pencil, in a different hand, added to the margin of the official record, at some later point, by someone who had felt compelled to add something that the original entry had not contained, and had done so in the smallest, least obtrusive way available. Departed, not died, not went away, or left for her health, or went to stay with family in the country, or any of the softening constructions that the period and the culture made available for describing a woman's absence in a way that managed the impression of it. Simply, departed. The plain, neutral verb of a person who has gone somewhere from which they have not returned, written by someone who either did not know the more specific truth, or had decided not to write it in a record that would be kept. Charlotte read those 4 words 3 times. Then she closed the register and sat back in the library chair, with her hands in her lap and the locket in her pocket, and looked at the low flame of the lamp. She thought about what it meant to come to a house as a young woman of 23, to marry into it and to begin building a life inside its walls, to see something through a door that was not fully closed and to be frightened by what you saw, to go to the people who could explain it and to receive from them something that was not an explanation, to live with the unexplained thing growing larger in the imagination, year after year, in a house where the walls seemed to hold it and the people seemed to know it, and nobody would tell you what it was, to have a child in that house, to hold a baby in the house where the unexplained thing lived, and then to leave. She thought about the pencil note in the margin of the estate register, departed in the boy's first year. 4 words added by someone who apparently felt that the official record's silence was inadequate, but who did not feel authorized, or perhaps did not know how, to say more than those 4 words. Behind her, the library door opened. She turned. Edmund stood in the doorway, his tie loosened, his coat still on, the specific expression of a man who has just spent 2 hours on something he did not want to be spending time on, and who is now confronted with something he has been postponing. He looked at Charlotte's face. He looked at the open register on the table. He looked at her hand, and what she was placing on the table between them, the locket. His expression changed, not with shock, but with the specific recognition of something seen that was not supposed to be seen yet, the arrival of a moment that has been anticipated for a long time, in a form that was not quite chosen. "You found it," he said. "In the writing desk," Charlotte said. "The top left drawer." She pushed the register slightly toward him, so he could see the page. "And I found the entry for Margaret Ashcombe. She departed in the boy's first year." Someone added that in the margin in pencil, at some point after the original entry was made. "I also found her in the portrait gallery. She is the only duchess in the sequence with no portrait, only a printed card with her name and the year she married, and a hook on the wall, and a rectangle on the wallpaper where the canvas used to be." She opened the locket and placed it on the table between them. Edmund came in and sat across from her. He looked at the paper with the name and the date on it. He was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was not avoiding but gathering, putting things in the right order before they were said. Then he drew a slow breath and looked at Charlotte. "I was going to tell you tonight," he said. "You are telling me tonight," Charlotte said. "The explanation simply has rather more evidence already in view than you planned for." She folded her hands.
"Tell me."
"From the beginning." Edmund looked at the locket for another moment. Then he looked at his wife. Then he began. The room was beautiful. She had been aware of this when she first came up with Edmund after the ceremony, receiving its details in the way you receive details when you are in the midst of something larger, noted, stored, not yet fully processed. Now, alone in it, she received it more completely. High ceiling with old plasterwork, tall windows that looked out over the east garden. Dark now, the lawn invisible in the September night. A fireplace with carved stone surround. The coals in the grate gone to a deep orange glow. Heavy drapes in a deep blue-gray that had the slightly faded quality of fabric, very well maintained over a long time. The furniture was old and excellent. The kind of furniture that had belonged to someone specific, and had been used and cared for, and had accumulated the particular quality of objects that are used rather than displayed. The writing desk near the window was a beautiful piece. She had noticed it when she came in. She had a habit of noticing desks, a legacy of her father's house, where desks were taken seriously. This one was old mahogany, with a curved tambour lid that rolled back to reveal the writing surface, and a set of small drawers at the back, arranged in 2 rows of 3. The kind of desk made for correspondence and for daily use, solid enough to last centuries, and designed to be functional rather than ornamental. She sat at it without any particular intention, beyond needing a surface that was not the bed. She had sat at desks her whole life for the specific quality of thinking they produced. Upright, organized, the surface in front of you implying purposeful activity even when the purpose was not yet clear. She sat now and thought about the gallery and what she had found in it, and what it added to what she had seen through the gap in Eleanor's door 2 nights ago. The information was accumulating into a shape. The shape was not yet complete. There were significant pieces missing, the most important ones being the piece that explained why it was done, and the piece that explained why it was never explained to the women who did it. Those pieces were in this house. She was certain of that. They were in this house, and they were in the people in this house, and they would be given to her, by those people, or she would find them herself. She was not a person who stopped looking, because the looking was inconvenient for someone else. She pulled open the top left drawer. After she found the locket and the paper inside it, she sat for a long time at the desk, with both objects in her hands, turning them over, considering them. Not the paper's contents. She had read those already, twice. But the objects themselves. The locket, old, well-made, maintained. The velvet in the drawer, cut specifically, placed specifically. The paper, folded many times. The folds the permanent shape of a document that had been folded this way for decades. Someone had put these here deliberately. Not recently. The paper and the locket had the quality of things that had been sitting in a specific place for a long time. But not accidentally either. The velvet was cut to fit the drawer. The locket was centered on it. This was placement, not accumulation. She thought, this was put here for me to find. Or not specifically for me, for whoever came next. For the next woman who would sit at this desk in the room that was now hers, and pull open the top left drawer, and find what had been placed there for her. She stayed at the desk for a while longer, turning the locket in her hand, before she went to the library. The library was cool when she arrived. The fire had not been laid here, and the room had the specific chill of a space that is heated by use rather than by standing provision. The lamp on the center table was burning low, as it apparently was every night, for whoever might need it. Charlotte raised it and stood for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the brighter light and looking at the rows of shelves. The estate registers were on the lower left shelves. She had been shown them during the afternoon's tour, and had noted their location with the peripheral attention she gave to things she thought she might need later. She found the relevant volume and brought it to the table and sat down with it. Reading the entry for Margaret Ashcombe took her less time than she expected. The entry was brief. Briefer than she expected for a woman who had been married to the Duke of the house. Arrived, married, a son born, and then the penciled note in the margin, someone else's handwriting, added later, departed in the boy's first year. She sat with this for some time after reading it. The fire was cold in this room, and the lamp's warmth was the only warmth available, and she sat in its circle of light and thought about 4 words, written in pencil, in the margin of a family record, by someone who apparently felt that the silence the official record maintained was in some small way inadequate, and who had added this much and no more. Departed, not died, departed, a word that covers the ground without explaining the ground it covers. A word chosen by someone who knew more than it said, and had decided not to say more than this. She was still sitting with it, the locket in her hand, when the door opened. The first morning after the wedding was quieter than the one before it. The hall had returned to its everyday proportions. Extra staff gone, rooms restored, the flowers still in their vases but no longer added to, the building breathing at its ordinary pace, after the larger rhythm of the day before. Charlotte woke before Edmund and lay still for a while, listening to the house settle around her, and thinking through what he had told her in the library, until well past midnight. He had not told her everything. The hour had run out before he could, and she had let it, because she could see in his face that he was telling her the truth, and that the truth had more parts than one late night could contain. But he had told her enough. Enough to understand that the locket was real, and its history was real. Enough to understand that a woman named Margaret Ashcombe had been driven out of this house by something that should have been explained to her, and was not. Enough to understand that more than one person in this household had possessed the full account for a considerable time, and had made, for various reasons, the decision not to give it. Edmund's breathing was still slow, and even beside her. She dressed quietly without waking him. She needed to speak to Mrs. Pemberton before she did anything else. The still room was off the east corridor on the ground floor, a working room that smelled of dried herbs and the particular productive quiet of a space designed for actual use. The shelves held labeled jars and bundled material, and the small tools of domestic management, arranged in the orderly way of a person who worked in here every day and knew precisely where everything was. Mrs. Pemberton was at the worktop when Charlotte came in, separating a bunch of lavender by stem quality, with the careful attention she brought to everything. She looked up. She looked at the locket Charlotte was holding. Charlotte set it on the worktop between them. She had thought about how to open this conversation, and had decided that the most useful thing she could do was this: put the object on the surface between them, and say nothing, because the most important first question was what Mrs. Pemberton chose to do when she saw it. What Mrs. Pemberton did was look at it for a moment that was longer than simple recognition required. She set down the lavender. She looked at the locket with the expression of someone who has been expecting to encounter something for a long time, and has arrived at a complicated set of feelings about the encountering. She did not touch it. She looked at it. Then she said, "Sit down, please." Charlotte pulled the wooden stool from under the worktop and sat. Mrs. Pemberton remained standing. She looked at the small window for a moment, at the kitchen garden lying in the mild September morning outside, and then back at Charlotte. "I will tell you what I know," she said. "I want to say at the start that what I know is not the whole of it. I have pieces of it, gathered over a long time, not all the pieces." "Tell me the pieces you have," Charlotte said. She had been at Ashcombe Hall for 41 years, Mrs. Pemberton said, which Charlotte already knew. She had come at 16, and the hall had been as it was, a large house, with its own deep rhythms, its own particular customs, its own way of doing things that had been established over many generations, and was not subject to revision, simply because a person new to it had arrived, and not yet learned what those things were. You learned the hall by proximity, by watching, by the gradual accumulation of understanding that came from being in close contact with a family's life over decades. This was its own kind of knowledge, and it was different from the kind of knowledge that came from being told. The first time she had seen what Charlotte had apparently seen, a door not fully closed, a young maid with silver scissors, a duchess in a chair before her mirror. She had been perhaps 18 years old. She had been told by the senior housemaid who trained her that this was something that happened, and that it was not something that was discussed, and that had been the complete extent of the explanation available to her at the time. In the decades since, she had accumulated more. Not from being told directly. The hall did not work that way, and she had learned early that asking certain questions directly was not how one obtained answers to them, but from observation, from the residue that a family's life leaves in the spaces where it is lived, from the patterns that became visible when you watched something over 40 years rather than over 40 weeks. She knew the ritual had been performed every generation she could account for, and in generations before her own service according to the older staff who were at the hall when she had arrived as a young housemaid. She knew its specific elements, always the night before the wedding, always from the left side, always preserved in a locket of this design, the locket kept afterward in the writing desk in the marital chambers. She knew that the custom had the quality of an obligation rather than a preference, the quality of a thing maintained because it must be maintained, not because anyone would miss it if it stopped. And she knew that there had been 2 women in the family's history who had not carried it quietly. The first, she said, was the wife of a duke in the earlier part of this century, a woman who had been given the standard account, tradition, family custom, the way things were done here, and who had responded to this account by refusing openly. She had told her mother-in-law directly that she considered the whole of it to be nonsensical and that she would not be performing it. The mother-in-law had been wounded by this, not as a matter of vanity, but because the tradition had been something she held with genuine feeling, even if she had not explained the depth of that feeling clearly enough to be understood. The husband had been placed in the impossible position of a man required to choose between his wife's contempt and his mother's hurt, and had done what many men did in such situations, withdrawn from the subject entirely, left it unaddressed, and allowed it to calcify into the permanent condition of his marriage. It was not a curse, Mrs. Pemberton said. I want to be clear about that, because I do not believe in curses, and I will not describe it in those terms. What it was, what it became, was the specific damage that occurs when something important to one person is openly dismissed by another, and the person in the middle declines to mediate. The dismissal and the wound it caused, and the husband's failure to address either, produced a fracture between that wife and her husband's family that simply never healed. It became the permanent condition of the relationship, cold, polite in the public sense, genuinely cold in every other sense. Charlotte said, and the second. The second did not refuse openly, Mrs. Pemberton said. She came to the hall willing enough. She had been told it was tradition, which it is, and she complied in the first year, with the equanimity of a woman who goes along with unfamiliar things, in an unfamiliar household, on the reasonable expectation that she will eventually understand them. But the understanding never came. What came instead, in the second year and the third, was more of the same. An explained requirement. The same deflection when she asked questions. The same growing awareness that she was participating in something whose meaning everyone around her apparently possessed, and nobody would give to her. By the second year she found she could not continue. She stopped, quietly, without confrontation or announcement, and because nobody addressed it, because the husband changed the subject when it arose, and the family simply absorbed her refusal, as though it were a weather event. The distance it opened between her and the house she was living in was never acknowledged, and therefore never closed. Mrs. Pemberton looked at Charlotte directly. I do not believe in curses, she said again. I believe in people. I believe in what happens to people when they are given something to do, without being given the understanding of what they are doing, and when the understanding is withheld for long enough that the doing becomes frightening rather than meaningful. A thing performed without meaning is not an act of acknowledgement, it is a weight, and a weight attached to no explanation, in a house that declines to explain itself, grows heavier over time rather than lighter. Charlotte looked at the locket on the worktop. Margaret Ashcombe, she said. Yes, Mrs. Pemberton said, quietly, with something in the single word that was not quite sorrow, but was adjacent to it. She found out the way I found out, Charlotte said, through a door that was not fully closed, and nobody told her what it was. So I understand. I was not at the hall in her time. She was here in the 1840s, before I came. But the older staff who were here when I arrived spoke of her. Not at length. She was not a subject that was encouraged. But enough. Mrs. Pemberton's hands were still. She was a frightened woman who was never told the truth. That is the simplest way to say what happened to her. And I think it is also the most accurate. Charlotte sat with this for a moment. I should have spoken to you before the wedding, Mrs. Pemberton said. The admission was direct, without softening. The Duchess's instruction has always been that family matters of this kind were not the housekeeper's place to raise with incoming family members. I have observed that instruction because I believed the family would handle it themselves. This time I was wrong to observe it. I am sorry. Go to Duchess Eleanor, Mrs. Pemberton said, after a pause. Speak to her plainly. I believe she will speak plainly in return. She has been carrying this alone for longer than she should have, and I think she is ready, perhaps has been ready for some time, for someone to bring it to her honestly. She picked up the lavender again, but did not begin sorting it. My own feeling is that she has been waiting for exactly this. Charlotte picked up the locket from the worktop. She stood for a moment. Thank you, she said, for telling me what you know. I wish it had been sooner, Mrs. Pemberton said. She did not look up from the lavender. That is what I will carry from this, I expect. Charlotte went out into the corridor. She stood for a moment with her hand flat against the cool stone of the wall. Then she turned and went to find Eleanor. She stood for a moment in the east corridor after leaving the still room, her back against the cool stone wall, the locket warm in her hand from the conversation and from the minutes of holding it. She thought about what Mrs. Pemberton had said about people, about what happened to them in the dark, about the two women who had carried the thing without its meaning, and the specific, non-supernatural, entirely human damage that had produced, about Margaret Ashcombe, frightened out of her home by something nobody would explain. And she thought about what Mrs. Pemberton had not quite said, which was that she, the housekeeper, 41 years at the Hall, 41 years of knowing things she was not meant to know, and keeping them in the way of someone who understood which things were hers to keep, had carried this piece of the story for a very long time with no one to give it to. That was its own kind of weight. Charlotte understood it. She had spent enough of her professional life around people who carried knowledge that was uncomfortable to hold and uncomfortable to give away. Documents that said things nobody wanted said. Accounts that revealed things nobody wanted revealed. You could not keep that knowledge light by pretending it wasn't there. It sat in you, and it had substance, and after enough time it shaped you. Not in the dramatic ways of fiction, but in the small, practical ways of actual human beings. The slight wariness, the habit of careful phrasing, the instinct to check twice before speaking once. She had seen all of this in Mrs. Pemberton in the past 15 minutes. The wariness, the precision, the care, the relief, underneath the care, of someone being asked directly for something they had been holding carefully for a long time. She pushed off from the wall and began walking toward the east wing. Eleanor's sitting room was on the first floor, along the east corridor, past the guest rooms that had been used over the past 2 days for the arriving family members. Charlotte walked it slowly, not because she was uncertain, but because she found that walking at a considered pace helped her arrange what she was going to say. She was not going to this conversation with an accusation. She was not going with anger, which was a thing she was being careful about, because the anger was there, was genuinely there, a small and specific anger at being given something to discover rather than something to know. But the anger was not the point, and leading with it would close the conversation rather than open it. What she was going with was the locket and the name and the question, and after the question, she was going with the full account of what she had found and what she had understood from it, and after that, she was going with what she intended to do about it. Because she had, somewhere in the quiet of the still room and the walk along the east corridor, arrived at what she intended to do about it. She could feel the shape of it clearly, the way she felt the shape of a problem when the thinking had done its work, and what was left was the doing. She knocked on Eleanor's door at 10 o'clock precisely, and Eleanor said, "Come in," and she came in. The sitting room received her in its usual way, warm from the fire, quietly personal, the particular quality of a space that belonged to the person who used it rather than to the house they occupied. Charlotte sat without being invited and put the locket on the desk and said, "Tell me everything." And Eleanor looked at the locket with the expression of someone who had been waiting, precisely, for this. Eleanor told her. Charlotte listened with the full attention she gave to anything she needed to understand. Not passive, not merely receptive, but actively attending, tracking the account against what she already knew, checking it against the evidence she had gathered, noting where it confirmed, and where it expanded, and where it left things still requiring explanation. Eleanor was a precise narrator. She did not embellish and she did not omit. She told the story of Frederick and the Croft daughter, and the agreement of 1743, and the meaning behind the ritual, with the same clear, measured delivery she brought to everything else. The thing she was saying was difficult, but the telling of it was not difficult for her, Charlotte thought. She had told this story before, or had told versions of it, or had held it in mind so many times that the telling of it had become familiar. What had not been familiar, apparently, was telling it to the person who most needed to hear it. By the time Eleanor reached Margaret Ashcombe's name and said she left when her son was 7 months old, Charlotte had the complete picture. Not every detail. There were details still in the records room, still in the boxes and ledgers of the estate's long memory, but the shape of it, the original good faith intention, the erosion of meaning over generations, the failure to give the necessary account, the damage the silence had done, and the particular, irrecoverable damage it had done to Margaret Ashcombe, who had left in 1851 and not come back. Eleanor said, "I am sorry," and Charlotte believed her. Not because Eleanor performed the apology, but precisely because she did not perform it, because she said it plainly, and let it be what it was, without the management of someone trying to achieve a particular effect with the admission. Just the admission, given as what it was. "Thank you for telling me now," Charlotte said. "Tell me about the Croft family." Charlotte knocked on the door of Eleanor's sitting room at 10 o'clock and was told, in Eleanor's clear and unhurried voice, to come in. She had chosen 10 deliberately, not the breakfast hour, which was too rushed and too unsettled, not the later morning, which would be taken up with the ordinary business of running a house. 10 o'clock in the morning was the hour at which the hall had settled into its daily rhythm, and Eleanor would be at her desk, her correspondence attended to, her morning tea finished, the particular composed stillness of a woman who had long made her peace with her own company in the mornings. Charlotte wanted this conversation between two people who were ready for it. She did not want to catch anyone off their footing. The sitting room was one of the rooms in the hall that Charlotte liked most, though she had been in it only twice before. It had the quality of a room that was genuinely used, books on the shelves that showed signs of actual reading rather than decorative arrangement, furniture positioned by habit and convenience rather than design intention, a fire in the grate that had been lit at a practical hour. On the mantelpiece was a photograph she had not noticed on her previous visits, a young couple somewhere outdoors, photographed without ceremony, both of them looking happy, in the uncurated way of people who are not aware of being photographed, or have decided not to perform for the camera. Eleanor was at her desk with a pen and a letter she had not yet finished. She set the pen down when Charlotte came in, and looked at her with the composed, level attention she brought to everything. Not coldness, not managed warmth, simply the specific quality of a woman who had spent many years thinking before she responded to things, and had developed, as a consequence, the ability to remain very still while she did it. Charlotte sat in the chair across the desk without waiting to be invited. She placed the locket on the desk's surface between them. Eleanor looked at it. She looked at it with the expression of someone who recognizes something, and recognizes the significance of where it has appeared, and who is giving themselves a moment to prepare before responding. Not surprise. Charlotte had not expected surprise, and there was none. Something closer to the expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing, and is now attending to its arrival with everything they have. Charlotte said, "Tell me everything, from the beginning." Eleanor set down her pen completely. She looked at the locket for a moment more. Then she folded her hands on the desk and looked at Charlotte and began. "In 1743, she said, the heir to the Ashcombe estate was a young man named Frederick. He was the second Duke's son, and he had been formally betrothed, for slightly more than a year, to the eldest daughter of the Croft family. The Crofts were not wealthy in the way the Ashcombes were. No title, no estate on this scale. But they were a family of good standing in the county, their name respected, their position solid, and the match between their daughter and the Ashcombe heir had been arranged with the agreement and approval of both families. It was considered sensible, appropriate, and honorable. Everyone who had been part of arranging it considered it to be so. Frederick broke the betrothal. He had gone to London in the spring of that year, she continued. The kind of trip that young men of his position made as a matter of course, partly social and partly educational in the broadest sense of the word. In London he met a woman, not someone arranged for him, not a match made with any particular intention, simply a woman, from a good family, met at a dinner, and then encountered again, and by the third occasion, he had understood that he could not return to Ashcombe, and proceed with the life he had been moving toward as though this had not happened. He was not dishonest about it. He came back to the estate, told his father, and went to the Croft family with the news, as gently and as directly as he could manage. He dissolved the betrothal. The following year he married the woman he had met in London. The family records suggested they were genuinely content together for many years. The Croft family was not content. Their daughter had spent more than a year conducting herself as a woman who was going to be married. The county knew of the arrangement. When it was dissolved, the county did what it always did with these situations, which was to produce and circulate questions. What had the woman done? What had she not done? Why had he changed his mind? What quality had she lacked? These questions did not require accurate answers in order to cause damage. The questions themselves were sufficient. The Croft daughter had done nothing wrong. She had been entirely proper throughout. She was harmed anyway, because the mechanics of the situation produced harm as a natural consequence regardless of her conduct or her character, and there was no mechanism by which she could dispute or recover from that harm. The Croft family, the father, the son who would be heir, the principal family members, had come to the Ashcombes. The conversation that followed had been difficult and honest, in roughly equal measure, and what it had produced was a formal agreement, a document, signed and witnessed, setting out two things the Ashcombe family committed to. The first, an annual acknowledgement, a visit, a notation in the family record, the maintenance of a respectful and continuing relationship with the family that had been harmed, not publicly, not as a performance of penance, but genuinely. A private and sustained acknowledgement that harm had been caused to people who had deserved better, and that this was not forgotten and would not be pretended away. The second, the personal act of remembrance. Each new duchess, at the threshold of her marriage, would perform a small personal act in acknowledgement that she was entering a family which had once caused real harm to a real woman. Something of herself, given freely. Not penance, Eleanor used the word with precision, to distinguish it from what the act was not. Not self-punishment or display of shame, an act of acknowledgement made by a person who understood what she was joining, and chose to join it knowing its full history, and chose to mark that knowing with something of herself. The hair had been chosen, Eleanor continued, because it was intimate. A sum of money would be impersonal. Anyone could give money. An object would be impersonal. Anyone could give objects. Hair was specific to the person. It grew from this particular body, had this particular color and texture, had been growing for this particular span of time. It caused something real and non-transferable. And the position, the left side, above the ear, where any normal arrangement of hair would conceal the cut entirely, had been chosen precisely because the act was private. It was not a display. It was not done for an audience, or to be witnessed by the world. It was something between the woman performing it and the history she was entering. Something she knew she had done, even when no one else could see it. The locket was to hold the offering. The locket was to be kept in the writing desk of the marital chambers, where it would be found by the next woman who came to the hall, and found by a woman who had been told what it was before she found it. And the meaning became separated from the act, Charlotte said. Over time, Eleanor said. Yes, the document still existed. The annual acknowledgement to the Croft family was still being made. But 2 generations on, the women who came to the hall as duchesses had not known the Croft family and had not witnessed the original event. What they received was the act, not the story of the act, not the reason, not the history, not the choice. Only the act, presented as tradition, which it was, by then, and the expectation that it would be performed. She looked at her hands for a moment. An act given without its meaning is not an acknowledgement, she said. It is something strange and unexplained that you are asked to do with something of yourself, for reasons no one will give you, that is treated with a weight and seriousness that makes no sense in the absence of any explanation. That is not what the original agreement intended. The agreement intended honesty. Arthur Croft wrote at the bottom of the agreement, in his own hand, "Let it be done honestly, and let it mean something." Those were the specific words he added. Honesty, meaning. Those were the requirements. Charlotte said, "Tell me about the women who could not carry it." Eleanor told her about the first, the wife who had refused openly, the marriage that had fractured. Not from supernatural cause, she said again, but from the specific and entirely human damage done when one person's deep-held commitment met another's open contempt, with no one willing to mediate or address it directly. She told her about the second, the wife who had stopped quietly, and the permanent estrangement that had followed, not because she was wrong to stop, but because nobody ever talked about it honestly. And Margaret Ashcombe, Charlotte said. Eleanor's expression changed. Something claimed itself in her face, an ownership, a recognition of something that belonged to her story, even at this remove. She came in 1845, she said. She found out the way you found out, I believe, through a door not fully closed. She went to her husband. He knew the full story, as the dukes in the line were told it. He had intended to tell her and had not done it, and when she came to him he was ashamed of the having not done it, and embarrassed by the shame, and evasive about the embarrassment, which is what people do when they have made an error and have not yet decided to correct it. She received from him something much less than the truth. A pause. She left when her son was 7 months old, Eleanor said. She went to her sister in Yorkshire, and she did not return. Not when her husband died, not at any point in the 30 years she outlived him. Her portrait was removed. I do not know precisely when or by whose decision, and a card was put in its place. That is how Margaret Ashcombe exists in this house now, as a card with a name and a date, and an empty wall. She held Charlotte's gaze. I should have told you before the wedding, she said. Her voice was level and direct, without the softening of qualification or the framing of context. My own mother-in-law told me everything the week before my wedding. She sat with me and gave me the full history, and she said, When your son marries, you must do the same for his wife. Tell her before the wedding. Give her the full knowledge and the real choice. A pause. I did not do that. I allowed the months to pass, and the date to be set, and the invitations to go out, and I kept believing that the right moment would appear. And then the moment was the night before your wedding, and I was in my room with the scissors. She looked at the locket on the desk between them. I am sorry, she said, plain and direct and unframed. Not as formality. You deserve to know from the beginning. Charlotte received this without any visible movement. She held it for a moment. Then she said, Tell me about the Croft family. Tell me what became of them. Charlotte sat with what Eleanor had told her for a long moment after the Duchess finished speaking. She was in the habit, when she had received a large quantity of information that required processing, of going quiet for a moment before she responded. Not because she was gathering herself, she was generally gathered, but because she believed that information deserved a few seconds of actual reception before it was met with a reaction, and that the reaction produced after a few seconds of real reception was generally more accurate and more useful than the reaction produced in the first breath. Eleanor appeared to understand this habit. She did not fill the silence with anything. She sat across the desk and waited, with the patience of someone who had also spent a lifetime thinking before speaking, for Charlotte to be ready. What Charlotte was doing, in the quiet, was checking what she had heard against what she already knew. The 1743 agreement, confirmed by Eleanor's account. The Croft family and the original harm, confirmed. The meaning of the ritual, an act of acknowledgement at the threshold of the marriage, something personal, given freely, with the specific knowledge of what it meant and why, confirmed. The loss of meaning over generations, confirmed. The two marriages that had fractured or estranged, confirmed by Mrs. Pemberton's account and expanded by Eleanor's more detailed version. And Margaret Ashcombe, confirmed, with more than Charlotte had known from the estate register and the miniature. A woman who had come to the hall at 23, who had found out by accident rather than by being told, who had gone to her husband for an explanation and had received something insufficient, who had lived with the insufficiency for 6 years and a son, and had then departed and not returned. The agreement had said, let it be done honestly, and let it mean something. It had not been done honestly, and without the honesty, it had not meant anything to the women who had performed it, without understanding it. It had been a weight without a reason, which was the worst kind of weight to carry. Charlotte looked at the locket sitting on the desk between them. She thought about the women in the gallery, about the specific, barely perceptible variation recorded in each of their later portraits, about the ones who had known the full history, like Louisa, who had written about it with intelligence and care in her diary, and the ones who had performed the act without the history, who had known only that it was tradition, and that tradition was expected. The knowing and the not knowing were not the same experience. They had not been the same marriage. They had not produced the same life. Tell me about the Croft family, Charlotte said. What became of them, and what you know about where things stand between the families now. Eleanor told her. The annual acknowledgement had been faithfully maintained for 150 years, she said. She had found the records, a notation each year in the relevant ledger, a consistent pattern from 1745 through to the end of the 19th century. And then, in the early years of this century, the pattern had stopped. She did not know whether it had stopped with deliberation or simply through the absence of anyone who remembered to continue it. The Duke at the time had been, by Eleanor's account, a man more interested in his horses and his club than in his estate's old obligations. The Croft family is still in the county, Charlotte said. Yes, I believe so. Eleanor looked at her. You have found them. In the county records, a family of that name, 6 miles from here. Charlotte paused. The agreement said the acknowledgement was to be maintained as long as both families survived. Yes, Eleanor said. Then we have work to do, Charlotte said. More than one kind. She picked up the locket from the desk and held it for a moment. Then she set it down and looked at Eleanor directly. I am not here to end anything, she said. I want you to understand that clearly before we go further. Eleanor looked at her. The expression on the Duchess's face was again that barely perceptible release, the small movement of something that had been held carefully in position for a long time. Then tell me, she said, what you are here to begin. Charlotte spent the better part of the following day in the estate records room, which was off the east corridor on the ground floor. A small, slightly cold space lined from floor to ceiling, with ledgers, bound correspondence, and stacked documents in folders that had sat undisturbed for varying periods of time, the undisturbed quality visible in the precise degree of dust on each shelf. The room smelled of old paper and the dry, fine dust that accumulates in rooms that are used carefully and infrequently. Edmund brought tea at 11 o'clock and set it on the edge of the table, and went away again, without asking any questions. Which was exactly right. She had told him that morning that she needed to do this part of it alone, and he had accepted this without argument or pressure, which was one of the things she valued most in him. She began with the names and dates she had, and worked outward from there. The formal agreement of 1743 was in a folder at the back of the second shelf, behind a set of large estate survey maps that had clearly not been moved in many years. The maps themselves had a quality of careful, permanent storage rather than regular use, and the folder behind them had the same quality. Charlotte carried it to the table and untied the ribbon that held it closed. It was a document of 3 pages, written in the precise, formal legal language of the mid-18th century. Careful constructions, specific terminology, the deliberate specificity of something meant to last and to be read by people who had not been present at its making. She read it slowly. The terms were what Eleanor had described, the annual acknowledgement, defined with enough precision to make clear that a perfunctory visit would not satisfy it, the personal act of remembrance, described in careful language that left no ambiguity about what it required. At the bottom of the 3rd page, below the official text and the signatures and the witnesses' attestations, in a handwriting that was different from the careful clerical hand of the document itself, more personal, the pressure different, the letters formed with the slight irregularity of someone writing for themselves rather than for a record, was a short passage added below the line. The intention of this agreement is not to punish, but to remember. Let it be done honestly, and let it mean something. Charlotte read this several times. She thought about a man named Arthur Croft, in 1743, picking up his pen after the formal document was completed, and adding these 2 sentences in his own hand. Not required to, not asked to. Adding them because he had decided that the formal language of the agreement was not sufficient to carry what the agreement was actually for, that the terms of it might be met without the spirit of it being met, and that the spirit of it was what he needed to put on paper. Honesty, meaning, those were the things he had written down as requirements. Not obedience, not compliance. Honesty and meaning. She set the document carefully to one side and continued. The diary of the second Duchess was in a box on the 3rd shelf, among other personal papers from the early 19th century. Letters, receipts, small notebooks. The diary itself was a modest book, dark-covered, no title on the spine, the kind of book designed for use rather than for display. Charlotte opened it and found the entries that concerned her without much difficulty, following the dates forward from the year of the marriage. Louisa had been told everything. That was clear from the earliest entries of her time at the Hall. She had been given the full account before her wedding, by the Duchess who was already in the house, and she had received it with the thoughtful seriousness of a woman who understood that she had been given something real to think about. She wrote about it with the frankness of private writing, more direct than letters, less arranged, the actual thinking visible rather than its managed product. She had written, "She told me the full history on the Monday before the wedding. 3 hours, in the sitting room with the fire going. I asked questions and she answered them all. I thought about it for the rest of the week, and on the morning of the wedding, I found that what I felt was not reluctance, but something closer to understanding. Not that the harm the family had done was acceptable, it was not, and knowing its history did not make it so, but that knowing it was different from not knowing it. That entering this family with the full account was different from entering it without the account, even though the family I was entering was the same family in both cases. The knowledge changed what the entering meant." Charlotte read this entry twice. Then she read the next relevant one, from some months after the wedding. "The offering is not about submission," Louisa had written. "I have thought about this a great deal, and I want to record what I think it is, for my own clarity. It is about entering with open eyes into the story of this family, which includes harm the family has done. To give something of oneself freely at the beginning, something real, something personal, something of the body rather than of the wallet, is to say, I know what I am part of. I enter it, having been told what it is. I will not look away from what it is. She found the letter at the back of the diary. It was tucked into the last few pages, a separate document, folded carefully into the book, clearly not part of the diary itself, but stored with it, for the purpose of being found with it. It was written on better paper than the diary's pages, in Louisa's handwriting, but more formally than the diary entries, the handwriting of someone writing for a reader, rather than for themselves. The letter began, "My dear," and had no more specific address than that. Charlotte read it from beginning to end. Louisa had understood completely. The letter gave the full history, the betrothal, the Croft family, the agreement, the meaning of the act, why the hair had been chosen, what the locket was for. She explained what she had learned and why she thought it mattered to know it. She explained what she believed the difference was between doing the thing with understanding and doing it without, and why that difference was not a small one. She was frank about the two previous women who had not been able to continue, not condemnatory, simply honest. They had been placed in an impossible position by not being told what they needed to know, and the outcomes were what could have been expected from that. At the end, Louisa had written, "I am writing this because I was given the truth, and because the truth made the difference between something frightening and something purposeful. Please give this letter to the next one, and please give her the choice. If she reads this and understands what the tradition is, and decides she cannot participate in it, that refusal must be respected and discussed openly, not managed around. A tradition that requires concealment to continue is not a tradition, it is a weight." Charlotte set the letter down. She looked at the shelf of ledgers and folders and boxes in front of her. 2 centuries of one family's life in one place, accumulated in boxes and ledgers and bundles of letters. And somewhere in the accumulation, Louisa's letter had been put away, not destroyed. It was here. It had been kept, but not given. Louisa had written it for a specific woman, and had trusted that the women who came between them would pass it forward. And somewhere in the chain, the passing had stopped. Perhaps someone had died. Perhaps someone had waited for the right moment, and the moment had passed. Perhaps someone had decided, for reasons that had seemed good at the time, not to give it. The letter had stayed in the box at the back of the diary for decades, waiting for someone to find it. Charlotte turned to the records around Margaret Ashcombe. They were in a folder near the bottom of the 3rd shelf, sparse, as she had expected, and in the specific way of records that have been kept carefully without being kept fully. Household accounts from the 1840s. A small set of formal letters from solicitors following the 3rd Duke's death in 1851. References to arrangements made, to the Duchess's settled needs, to provisions for the future, all in the careful circumlocution of legal correspondence, on subjects it would be unwise to state directly. One letter referred to the Duchess's particular circumstances and the family's wish to ensure her settled well-being. Particular circumstances, settled well-being. The language of people who knew what they were not saying and had chosen not to say it. And then nothing. After 1851, the wall of institutional silence. Charlotte found the small box on the lowest shelf, pushed to the very back, the kind of accumulation box that appears in organized households when miscellaneous items need a place and someone creates one, rather than deciding which existing category they belong in. Inside, a stopped pocket watch, a set of miniature watercolors, a prayer card from a funeral, 2 small devotional books, and between the devotional books, tucked as though placed there once and never relocated, a painted miniature in an oval frame. Charlotte lifted it. The woman in it was young. Late 20s, she thought, which aligned with the timeline. Dark hair in the style of the 1840s, a face that was even and regular, the features well proportioned. The painter had been competent, and what the painter had captured, whether by skill or by accident or because it was so plainly visible in the subject's face that capturing it was unavoidable, was watchfulness. A careful, particular alertness, the quality of someone paying close attention to something just outside the frame, something they cannot quite see clearly and cannot stop trying to see. She was frightened. Not dramatically, not wide-eyed or trembling or anything theatrical. Quietly frightened, in the specific way of someone who has decided that the fear must be kept contained and manageable, and has been using energy to keep it that way for some time. The fear was visible anyway. Whatever the subject had wanted to present to the painter had recorded the fear alongside it. Charlotte turned the miniature over. On the backing board, in faint pencil, M.A., 1847. Margaret Ashcombe. 4 years after she arrived at the Hall. 3 years before her son was born. 4 years before the Duke died. Painted in 1847, in this house, by a painter who had recorded faithfully what was there. Charlotte set the miniature on the table and looked at it for a long time. She thought about what it was to live inside an unexplained thing. Not a terrible thing, not cruelty, not malice, not danger. Simply an unexplained thing. An act performed once a year that cost you something personal, and for which no explanation was ever given. A husband who deflected when you asked. A house that held the explanation in its walls and in its inhabitants, and declined, collectively and seemingly permanently, to give it. And the act itself growing stranger over time, in the absence of any explanation, becoming not smaller with familiarity, but larger in the imagination, until the imagination was carrying something much heavier than the truth ever would have been. She found the Croft family entries at the back of one of the 19th century ledgers, the annual acknowledgments recorded faithfully, year after year, from 1745 onward. She followed them forward through the decades, 1800, 1850, 1880, 1901, and then, in 1902, nothing. The entries simply stopped. No formal notation of cessation, no explanation. The relationship that Arthur Croft had written about, the one he had wanted to be honest, the one he had wanted to mean something, had been quietly allowed to expire. 2 generations of Ashcombes had simply not continued it. By the time the afternoon light had thinned, and the lamp on the records room table had become necessary, Charlotte had the full shape of what this was. Not a curse. Not something supernatural or irrational. A promise made in good faith by people trying to account honestly for real harm, that had been slowly disconnected from its meaning by the accumulation of silence. A letter written to correct the problem, not given. An annual acknowledgement let lapse without ceremony. A woman frightened out of her home by something nobody would explain, and underneath all of it, the 2 sentences Arthur Croft had written in his own hand. Not to punish but to remember, honestly and meaningfully. She set the miniature beside Louisa's letter on the table. 2 women from different decades, separated by years, connected by the same failure. One who had understood what was needed and written it down, and trusted that it would be given. One who had needed it and not received it. Charlotte thought, it does not end here. She gathered what she had found and went to look for Edmund. She set the miniature down beside Louisa's letter and sat for a while without moving. Outside the small window of the records room, the afternoon had moved into its later hours. The light was going from the quality of afternoon to the quality of early evening, the slightly golden, slightly cooling shift that happened in September as the day prepared to close. She had been in this room for most of the day and had not particularly noticed the time, which was what happened when work was real rather than performed. She thought about the letter, about Louisa writing it, sitting at a desk somewhere in this house, probably in the sitting room that was now Eleanor's sitting room, probably by a window with the grounds visible, writing to a woman she would never know, with the particular mixture of care and precision of someone who understood that what they were writing mattered. She had written it in good faith, and had trusted that it would be given, and it had been kept and not given. And the keeping and the not giving had been the mistake that had produced everything that followed. She thought about the difference between keeping and giving. The letter had been kept. Margaret Ashcombe had not been given it. The estate register had kept its record, departed in the boy's first year, but it had not given any explanation of the departure. The tradition itself had been kept, generation to generation, performed faithfully by women who had not been given the account that would have made it meaningful rather than frightening. Keeping and giving were not the same thing. You could maintain the physical object, the letter, the locket, the record, for 100 years, and the physical object's survival meant nothing if the knowledge it contained was not given to the person who needed it. Charlotte thought about her father, about the cases he had handled over his career, the estates, the wills, the trusts, the legal structures that were supposed to carry a family's wishes and intentions forward through generations. He had told her, many times, that the most common failure in such structures was not the failure of the structure itself, but the failure of the people administering it. The document was clear, the intention was clear, but the people between the document and the effect, the trustees, the executors, the administrators, would sometimes make decisions about what needed to be given and what could be held back, about what the person on the receiving end truly needed to know, about whether this particular moment was the right moment. And those decisions accumulated into gaps, into silences, into the specific kind of damage that had been done to Margaret Ashcombe, who had deserved the letter and had not received it. The answer was not a better structure. The answer was people who gave what needed to be given. Charlotte stood up, gathered what she had found, the agreement, the relevant diary entries she had copied out, Louisa's letter, the miniature, and went to find her husband. The hall's corridors were quiet at this hour, the staff having completed the afternoon's work and the household moving toward the preparations for dinner. Charlotte moved through them without hurrying, the lamp from the records room unnecessary now that the evening light was still sufficient in the main corridors. She passed the still room, dark and closed, past the entrance to the kitchen, where the sounds of dinner preparation were audible, past the foot of the staircase with its silver-framed portrait of Louisa looking composedly out from the frame. She stopped in front of the portrait. The woman who had written the letter, who had understood exactly what was needed, who had put the full truth on paper, and trusted the paper to go forward. Charlotte looked at her for a moment. "I found it," she said, very quietly. Not for any audience. Just because it seemed, in the quiet of the entrance hall at the end of a long day in the records room, like the right thing to say. Then she went to find Edmund. He found her first. She was in the corridor outside the records room, the lamp from the table still in her hand, when she heard his footsteps coming from the direction of the library. He had been looking for her. She could see it in the quality of his movement, when he turned the corner and found her. The slight, imperceptible easing of someone who has been searching, and has arrived. He looked at the lamp in her hand, and the folded papers she was carrying, and the miniature, which she had slipped into her coat pocket, but which had left a small oval impression in the fabric that was visible if you were looking at it. "The library's fire is still going," he said quietly. They went to the library. The fire was indeed going, laid well, still providing real heat, and the lamps on the center table were burning. Charlotte set the miniature on the table, and the papers beside it. Edmund sat across from her. He had not changed from the clothes of the afternoon. His coat was on, which told her he had been moving through the house rather than settled anywhere. He sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at what she had placed between them. "How much?" he said. "All of it," Charlotte said. "The 1743 agreement, Louisa's diary, Louisa's letter." She unfolded the letter and set it where he could read the first lines. The records around Margaret, what happened to her, and what the records show she was and was not told, and this. She took the miniature from her coat pocket and placed it facing him, the dark-haired young woman, with the watchful, frightened eyes, painted in 1847, by a painter who had recorded what was visible, without knowing what they were looking at. Edmund looked at the miniature. He did not say anything immediately. He looked at it for a long moment, in the way of someone looking at something that costs him something to look at. And then he looked up at Charlotte. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know." He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of evasion, not the quiet of someone choosing not to speak, but the quality of silence that Charlotte had learned to read as organization. Edmund did not think in rapid sequential bursts. He arranged things carefully before he said them, and he was arranging them now. She waited. "My father told me when I was 18, he said. "The summer before I went to university. He took me to his study. It was the morning room then. My mother changed it after his death. And he sat me down, and he told me the complete account. The Croft family, the betrothal, the agreement, the meaning of the ritual, all of it. He told it clearly and completely, without softening or omission." He paused. He had been told himself by his own father, who had been told by his father before him. The account had been passed down through the line of dukes as a specific obligation, not a casual piece of family history, but a requirement, something each duke was responsible for knowing and responsible for passing forward. She was watching his face, reading the quality of his telling. "My father told me that any man of this family who intended to bring a woman into it had an obligation that could not be passed over or postponed," Edmund continued. He said it in those words. He said, "You tell her. Before the wedding. Before anything is arranged, and before she has committed to anything she cannot undo. You give her the full history, and you give her the genuine choice. Not after the fact, but before it. You do not make her choice for her by withholding what she needs to make it." He stopped. He said it was the most important thing he had to say to me that summer. He said his own father had told him the same thing, and his father before him, and that each time the family had reached the generation where it would have mattered, they had, as far as he could tell, failed to do it. He looked at his hands on the table. He said, "You will not fail. I am telling you now precisely so that there is no question." Charlotte waited. "I did not tell you," Edmund said. He said it plainly, without construction or padding. He let it sit in the room between them, with the weight it deserved. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. She looked at his face, at the specific quality of his stillness, at the way he was meeting her eyes rather than looking away from them, at the absence in his expression of any movement toward self-protection or qualification. He was not reaching for a frame to place around the admission. He was simply making it. "I want to be completely honest about why," he said. "I owe you that." "Yes," she said, "you do." "It was not because I thought you would leave," he said. "I want to be precise about this, because imprecision would itself be a form of dishonesty. I do not think you would have left if I had told you. You are not a person who withdraws from complicated things. You are a person who examines them." He looked at the miniature between them. "What I was afraid of was more specific than that. I was afraid you would form your first substantial understanding of me, with this as the frame, that you would encounter the burden of this family, before you had encountered the person who came from it, and that the burden, seen before the person, would become the primary thing, that it would distort the picture, before you had a chance to see what was underneath it." He was quiet for a moment. "I made a calculation," he said. "I thought, if she knows me first, if she understands who I am as a person, before she learns what my family has carried, then the weight of it will be proportional. She will be able to weigh it against the rest of it. But if the first substantial thing she learns about my family is this, before she has had the chance to know the person she is marrying, then it becomes the primary thing. It becomes what I am, rather than something I come from." He looked at Charlotte directly. "I was wrong about my right to make that calculation on your behalf," he said. "Not wrong about whether knowing me first would have changed the scale of it. Perhaps it would have. But wrong to decide that for you. My father told me explicitly that the choice was yours, not mine. He told me that making the choice for the other person, deciding they didn't need to know, deciding that the timing was wrong, deciding that you knew better than they did what they should receive and when, was exactly the mistake every previous generation had made, and I made it anyway." He looked at the miniature. "I put you in the position she was in," he said. "Not as badly. You have been told, you know the full account, you know the reason. But I made you find out, rather than telling you. And I made you find out, on the night before your wedding, rather than before you made any decisions about this family at all. I am sorry for that." Charlotte looked at the miniature too, at Margaret Ashcombe, in 1847, with her watchful, frightened eyes, and the evidence of something she had been carrying for 4 years, without being given any words for it. Then she looked at Edmund. "If we have a son," she said, "and he finds a woman he wants to marry, will you tell her yourself, before any arrangement is made, before the ceremony, before she has committed to anything at all, with every piece of the truth, without deciding in advance what she needs to hear, or when she needs to hear it?" Edmund looked at her. "Yes," he said. It came out immediately, without any space for qualification or condition, or the slight hesitation that would have indicated calculation. Without question, yes. Charlotte nodded. She let the yes sit in the room for a moment, heard the quality of it, the specific ring of something said because it was simply true, not because it was the right thing to say. She reached across the table and set the miniature so it faced Edmund directly. The painted dark-haired woman, with her careful fear, looking at something outside the frame. Her name was Margaret Ashcombe, Charlotte said. She was 23 when she came here. She spent 6 years in this house, trying to understand something that 3 different people knew the answer to. She asked for the answer, and she did not receive it. She left when her son was 7 months old, and she never came back. She lived 30 years after her husband died, and spent all of them away from here. She looked at Edmund. She did not deserve that. Edmund looked at the painted face. He was very still. "No," he said, "she did not." "Then we are going to make sure it does not happen again," Charlotte said. "Not with a promise that will be forgotten in the next generation. Not with a letter put in a box at the back of a shelf, and not given." We are going to change the thing itself, so that whoever comes next, the woman our son brings here, or his son, or whoever comes after that, arrives knowing what she is entering, with the full account given before she is asked to do anything, before she is committed to anything, with genuine choice. She set Louisa's letter beside the miniature. Your great-great-grandmother tried to do this, Charlotte said. She wrote the truth down and trusted it to go forward, and it was put aside and not given. We are not going to let that happen again. Edmund looked at the letter. What do you need? Your mother's agreement, Charlotte said. And one more thing. He waited. We need to go and find the Croft family, Charlotte said. The annual acknowledgement, the 1743 agreement required, lapsed at the beginning of this century. 25 years of it simply not being done. They are still in the county. I found them in the records. A family in a village, 6 miles from here. She paused. The agreement said, let it be done honestly, and let it mean something. If we are going to restore what should have been done, we have to go and do it. In person, plainly. Edmund looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight, with the fire going behind him, and the night outside the tall library windows. All right, he said. When your mother agrees to come. She will agree, Charlotte said. And she meant it. The fire in the library gave the room a warmth that the rest of the house, in September, did not fully have at this hour. Charlotte was glad of it. She had been in the records room for most of the day, and had come away with a coldness in her that was partly the temperature of the room, and partly the temperature of what she had found in it, and the library's fire helped with both. Edmund had said nothing for a full 2 minutes after she placed the miniature in front of him. He had sat and looked at it, at the watchful, frightened face of a woman painted in 1847 in this house, with the specific quality of attention of someone encountering something they had known about abstractly, and are now encountering in its concrete form. You could know something in the abstract for a long time. You could hold it in your mind as information, as a fact, as an item in the account you maintained of yourself and your family. And then you could encounter its concrete form, and discover that the concrete form was different from the abstract knowledge, in ways the abstract knowledge had not prepared you for. Edmund had known about Margaret Ashcombe. Charlotte understood that now, had understood it since he said his father had told him everything. He had known her name and her story in the way of information passed down, and he had not known her face, and he was sitting with her face now, in the way of someone understanding the gap between those two things. She let him sit with it. She had learned, over months of knowing him, that the useful thing in moments when Edmund was working through something important was to give him the time to work through it. He did not dissemble. He did not perform. When something required sitting with, he sat with it, and the sitting was real rather than theatrical, and the conclusion he arrived at from the sitting was generally both accurate and honestly come to. He sat with the miniature for 2 full minutes and then began to speak, and what he said was everything Charlotte had suspected, and more than she had expected, in the frankness of its particulars. His father's account, the summer before university, the specific instruction, tell her, before the wedding, before any commitment is made, with the full truth and without editing. The acknowledgement that every previous generation had apparently failed to do this, and the explicit command not to fail. And then, I did not tell you. He said it simply. He did not dress it or frame it or surround it with qualifications designed to soften it. He said it as a plain statement of fact, which it was, and he let it be what it was. Charlotte listened to his account of why, with the same full attention she had given to everything else this week. He was trying, she could see, to be genuinely precise, not to construct a narrative that flattered him, but to give her the actual contents of the calculation he had made, and the actual reasoning behind it, and the actual place where the reasoning had been wrong. He had been afraid, that was the core of it, though he arrived at it through careful language, afraid that she would see the family before she saw him, afraid that the burden would become the frame that distorted the picture. She understood the fear. She could see how it had constructed itself, how it had seemed, in the moment of deciding, like reasonable caution, rather than the same avoidance that had produced every previous iteration of the same mistake. The mistake didn't feel like the mistake from inside it. It felt like care. That was what made it the mistake it was. When he finished, she let the silence sit for a moment. Then she asked him the question about their son, about whether he would tell her, the hypothetical woman who would come to this family in the next generation, before the ceremony, with every piece of the truth. without deciding in advance what she needed to hear or when she needed to hear it. He said yes, without a pause, without the slight hesitation of someone calculating whether yes was the right answer. The yes came from a place where the question had already been answered, which told her that the sitting with the miniature had done something real in him, had moved something from the abstract to the concrete in the way that seeing Margaret Ashcombe's face had been designed to do. She trusted that yes. She had thought about it carefully before she asked the question, and she trusted it. She told him her plan. She told him about Louisa's letter and what it had been intended to do and why it had not done it, and what she thought needed to happen for it to do what Louisa had intended. She told him about the Croft family and the lapsed acknowledgement and what restoring it would require. She told him that she needed Eleanor's agreement and that she believed Eleanor would give it. Edmund listened the way he always listened, with complete, still attention, tracking what she said without interrupting, asking no questions until she was finished. When she finished, he said, "All right." And she believed that too. She gathered the papers from the table. She picked up the miniature and put it carefully in her coat pocket. The fire in the library was still going, the room still warm, the lamps still burning. Outside the tall windows, the estate lay in the dark September night, the grounds invisible, the sky clear. Charlotte stood up. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "I will talk to Eleanor first." Edmund stood too. He looked at her across the library table, across the lamp between them, across the space that held everything they had just said, with the expression she had come to know as his clearest, the one without any management in it, the one that was simply him looking at her and seeing her accurately. "All right," he said again, "tomorrow morning." They went upstairs together, and the hall closed its nighttime quiet around them, and outside the windows, the grounds of Ashcombe lay still under the stars. Charlotte went to Eleanor's sitting room 2 mornings later, at 9 o'clock. She had 3 things with her: the locket from the writing desk, the miniature of Margaret Ashcombe, and Louisa's letter, unfolded and laid flat so that it was readable without being handled. She also had, in her coat pocket, a copy she had written out the night before of the passage at the bottom of the 1743 agreement, Arthur Croft's handwriting, those 2 sentences that changed the meaning of everything around them. The intention of this agreement is not to punish, but to remember. Let it be done honestly, and let it mean something. Eleanor was at her desk. She looked up when Charlotte came in, and set these 3 things on the desk between them in a row, and then sat down. Eleanor looked at the items in their row. She did not reach for any of them immediately. She simply looked at them with the particular quality of attention she brought to things she was taking seriously. "I am not here to end the tradition," Charlotte said. Eleanor's eyes moved from the row of objects to Charlotte's face. Something changed in her expression, a very subtle change, in the particular set of the muscles around her eyes, as though something that had been held carefully in a specific position for some time had been given permission to adjust. "Then what are you here to propose?" Eleanor said. Charlotte said, "The agreement of 1743 is not wrong. The harm done to the Croft family was real. The idea that a new duchess should enter this family, knowing its history, and acknowledging, with something of herself, the harm it has caused, that is not superstition, and it is not cruelty, and it is not something that should be abandoned." She paused. "What must change is this. The next woman who comes to this family will be told the full story before she is asked to do anything. Not the night before the wedding when the question cannot be undone. Not in pieces when she has already seen things she cannot yet make sense of. Before. With time to think and time to decide. With the genuine choice to participate or not, and with her refusal honored without damage if she makes it." She slid Louisa's letter across the desk. Eleanor looked at it. She picked it up and read it in the way she did everything. Thoroughly. Giving it the full attention it deserved. It took several minutes. Charlotte waited. When Eleanor set the letter down, she looked at the window for a moment. The morning garden was visible beyond the glass, the September light making long shapes across the lawn, the chapel quiet at the far end of the path. "My mother-in-law told me to tell the next one," Eleanor said. Her voice was level and direct in the way it was when she was not managing the thing she was saying, simply saying it. She said those exact words. She said, "When your son marries, you must sit with his wife before the wedding and tell her everything. Give her the full history, give her the real choice. That is what I was told to do, and I was told it clearly, and I understood what I was being told. She was quiet for a moment. "I did not do it," she said. "I intended to. And the months went by. And I continued intending to. And then the date was set, and the invitations were sent, and I was still intending to do it. And then the morning arrived, and the window had passed." She folded her hands on the desk in front of her. "I made the same mistake that Luisa's letter was written to prevent. I made it, knowing I was making it, and choosing to believe I would correct it, and then I did not correct it in time." She looked at Charlotte steadily. "I am sorry," she said, "not as a formality. I am genuinely sorry. You deserved to know from the beginning, and I failed to give you what you deserved." Charlotte said, "I know." She paused. "And I know that you are not the first person in this family to make that failure. I think that knowing that should be some small comfort, though I also think it should not let you off the hook, and I suspect you would agree." "I would agree," Eleanor said. They sat for a moment in the particular quiet of two people who have said necessary things and are now in the space that comes after. Then Charlotte took the passage from the agreement out of her coat pocket and set it beside the letter. Eleanor read it. She read Arthur Croft's 2 sentences and was still for a moment. "The Croft family is still in the county," Charlotte said. "There is a family of that name in a village 6 miles from here. I want us to go to them, not with ceremony, not with formality, not with letters sent in advance and prepared speeches. Simply as ourselves, arriving at their door, introducing ourselves, and telling them the truth. Telling them what the connection between the families is, what the original agreement was, and that the annual acknowledgement has lapsed and that we would like to restore it." She looked at Eleanor. "I would like you to come with us," she said. Eleanor said nothing for a moment. She looked at the 3 items on the desk, the locket, the miniature, the letter. She picked up the miniature and looked at Margaret Ashcomb's watchful, frightened face for what seemed like a long time. "She was a frightened woman," Eleanor said quietly, still looking at the miniature, "who was never given the truth. That was a failure of this family, long before I was part of it." She set the miniature down. "But I have had 40 years to do something about that failure, and I did nothing." A pause. "So perhaps it is also mine." "Perhaps it is," Charlotte said. "And perhaps that means you are particularly the right person to come with us." Eleanor looked at her. Something moved in the Duchess's expression that Charlotte thought she recognized. The expression of a woman who has been carrying something for a long time, and who has just been offered permission to put some of it down in the right place. "Yes," Eleanor said, "I will come." They drove to the village on a clear morning, 3 days later, in the mild autumn light that turned the countryside gold on either side of the road. Edmund drove. Charlotte sat beside him. Eleanor sat in the back with the composed, straight-backed posture she brought to every situation, and looked out the window at the fields and hedgerows passing. The village was small and unhurried. A church, a post office, a public house, a school, just visible at the end of a lane. The Croft house was at the far end of the main street, behind a low stone wall with a garden that had the slightly overgrown neatness of a garden tended by someone who loves it but does not have unlimited time for it. Edmund knocked. The woman who answered was in her early 50s, with the practical look of someone who had managed a good deal of the world's business without excessive fuss. She looked at the 3 of them on the doorstep with the wary curiosity of someone not accustomed to unexpected visitors, and the name Ashcombe produced in her face a reaction that was not immediately readable. A slight stilling, a brief adjustment. Charlotte introduced them, explained where they came from, and said that there was a matter of family history that concerned both families, and that they hoped she might have a few minutes for a conversation. The woman, Frances Croft, she said, married into the family 25 years ago, showed them through the house to a sitting room at the back that looked onto a long garden with a pear tree at the far end, still carrying the last of its fruit. A very old man sat in a wing chair near the window with a book on his lap. Walter Croft was 83. Charlotte saw immediately that he had been sharp for all of those years and had no intention of stopping. He looked at the 3 of them with the direct appraisal of someone who had long since given up wasting time on first impressions that he would have to revise, and had simply cut straight to the looking. "Sit down," he said. They sat. Frances Croft stayed in the room, standing near the doorway, her arms crossed in the casual way of someone who is both comfortable and paying attention. Charlotte told the story. She told it from the beginning, from Frederick Ashcombe and the betrothal, and the Croft daughter who had been left in a difficult position, through no fault of her own. She told it clearly, in plain language, without softening or elaborate qualification. She told them about the agreement and what its terms were and what they had meant. She told them that the annual acknowledgement had been maintained faithfully for 150 years and had lapsed in the early years of this century, and that they had come today to acknowledge that lapse and to restore the connection the agreement required. She also told them, because this seemed to her the necessary last piece, the piece without which the visit would be a formality rather than a genuine reckoning, that the tradition had caused harm to a woman in the family's history, because the tradition had been kept while its meaning had been hidden from her, and that the family was in the process of correcting that. Walter Croft listened to all of this without speaking. He sat with his book still on his lap and his reading glasses slightly pushed down his nose, and he did not ask any questions, and he did not interrupt. He simply listened, with the attentiveness of someone old enough to know that the thing being said mattered, and patient enough not to get in the way of it. When Charlotte finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My grandmother used to mention the business with the great house. She said there had been something between the families, once, some old business with a betrothal that had gone wrong. She did not know the details. Her own grandmother had told her, and by the time it reached my grandmother, it was more of a feeling than a story. A sense that there had been a connection once that had somehow been let go of." He looked at Charlotte. She did not say it with bitterness. She said it the way you mention a thing that you know once mattered, and you are not entirely sure why it no longer does. He was quiet for a moment. Then, well, he looked across at his daughter-in-law, and then back at Charlotte. "Someone ought to have done that a long time ago." It was not an accusation, and it was not a question. It was a statement of fact, offered without heat, by a man who had no interest in performing a grievance he had never actually carried, but who had enough respect for the truth to state it plainly. Francis Croft put the kettle on. Edmund and Walter discovered, within 10 minutes of unremarkable conversation, that they shared a deep interest in the historical survey maps of the county, and the ways in which old maps disagreed with each other at their boundaries, and this conversation carried them through a full hour, in the way that shared enthusiasms do when both participants are genuine. Charlotte sat with Francis Croft, and learned about the village, and about the family, and about Walter's particular devotion to the pear tree in the garden, which he had planted 40 years ago, and considered one of his better decisions. Eleanor sat in the corner of the room and drank her tea. At one point, when a moment of natural quiet fell over the room, Charlotte glanced at her mother-in-law and found her sitting with her eyes closed. Not asleep. Somewhere else, somewhere interior, somewhere she had apparently needed to go, and had not had the right moment to go until now. Her hands were in her lap. Her posture was as straight as always, but something in the set of her shoulders had shifted, very slightly, in the way of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has been told, finally, that they may set it down. They stayed for 2 hours. When they left, Walter Croft came to the door himself, slowly, with the deliberate care of a man who has learned to be careful with the body after 83 years of use, and shook Edmund's hand and then Charlotte's. "Tell your family," he said to Edmund, "that we are still here." A pause. "We are just people now, but we are still here." Edmund said, "I know. I am glad of it." They drove back to Ashcombe Hall in the early afternoon. The light was going golden at the edges by the time they turned up the long approach, and the hall received them as it always did. The old stone in the afternoon light, the ivy on the west facade, the formal garden lying below the east windows in its composed geometry. In Eleanor's sitting room, Charlotte set the locket on the desk one final time. Eleanor sat across from her. Edmund stood near the window, looking out at the garden where the chapel was visible at the far end of the path. Charlotte opened the locket. Inside, on the folded paper she had found in the writing desk weeks, that felt like years ago now, were the 2 pieces of information. Margaret Ashcombe, November the 4th, 1847. She read them aloud. The room was quiet when she finished. "She was a frightened woman," Eleanor said, "who was never told the truth." Her voice was level and plain. "That was a failure of this family." "Yes," Charlotte said, "and now she is also someone we remember correctly. Not as an absence in the gallery, not as a penciled note in a margin. As a woman who deserved the truth, and was not given it, and whose story is why we are doing this differently." She unfolded the piece of paper and set it on the desk. Then she took from her pocket the small page she had written out the night before, in her own handwriting, in clear and simple language. She read it aloud before placing it in the locket. This locket belongs to the Ashcombe family of Ashcombe Hall. It marks a tradition of personal acknowledgement connected to an agreement made in 1743, in which this family accepted responsibility for harm done to the Croft family of this county. The woman who holds this locket has been told the complete history of that agreement, including its origin and its meaning. She has been asked whether she chooses to continue the tradition, and her choice, whatever it is, has been honored. She enters this family with full knowledge and her own free decision. She folded the paper and placed it in the locket. The locket closed with the same quiet click she had first heard through the gap in a door at the end of a corridor, 3 weeks and a world ago. She handed it to Eleanor. Eleanor held it for a moment. Then she stood and walked out of the sitting room, up the staircase, along the east corridor, and into the marital chambers. Charlotte followed. Edmund came behind them. Eleanor opened the top left drawer of the writing desk and set the locket in the center of the dark velvet, exactly where Charlotte had found it. They stood in the room for a moment. "She will know what it is," Charlotte said. "Whoever finds it, she will know, because she has been told. She will not be frightened by it." "No," Eleanor said. "She will not." They went out into the corridor. Edmund and Eleanor walked ahead toward the staircase, talking quietly about something practical and unrelated, some matter of the estate, some detail of the coming week, and Charlotte paused at the window at the end of the corridor. Below her, the formal garden lay in the late afternoon light, the lawn going gold under the lowering sun, the long reflecting lake, perfectly still at the far end. The stone chapel sat at the end of the garden path in its ivy, wearing its 300 years with the same settled composure that it had brought to every occasion it had witnessed. It was the same chapel she had walked into 3 weeks ago, and the same chapel that would still be here, in this light, when everyone currently alive in this house was long gone. She looked at it and thought about chains. She thought about the image people used for inherited things, the chain, heavy and old, passed from hand to hand. The image implied that the only choices were to carry it or to break it, lift the weight or refuse it. She had spent the past 3 weeks discovering that there was a third possibility, one that was harder than either of those two, and more durable than both. You could hold the chain up to the light. You could name what it was. You could say, plainly and honestly, to every person who was going to be asked to carry any part of it, "This is what this is. This is where it came from. This is what it means. This is what it costs. And here is what it gives in return, and you may decide for yourself whether to take it." That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the only thing that had ever made the difference, not the carrying and not the breaking, but the naming. The refusal to let things go on being shadows when they could be made into objects with shapes and histories and comprehensible meanings. Below the window, the garden was going to amber in the last of the afternoon light. From somewhere in the house, she heard Edmund's voice, not calling for her, just present in the building the way he was present in it. His ordinary steady voice, somewhere in the rooms below, comfortable and particular, and known. She turned from the window and went to find him. She found him at the foot of the staircase, exactly where the small silver portrait of the second Duchess sat in its frame on the side table. He was not looking at the portrait. He was looking up the stairs toward the sound of Charlotte's footsteps, and when he saw her, he did what his face always did when she appeared. The same involuntary warming, the same fundamental settling, the same expression she had seen on him the first time. She understood that he loved her, and had never entirely stopped seeing since. She came down the last few steps and stood beside him. They both looked at the portrait for a moment. Louisa, the second Duchess, with her composed and private expression, and her long and complicated life, and her letter that had taken 70 years to reach the person it was meant for. "We should go in for dinner," Edmund said. Charlotte looked at the portrait for one more moment, at the woman who had written the truth down with careful hands, intending it to go forward, trusting that it would be given. It had been given now, late, and not in the way she had imagined, and by hands she could not have anticipated, but given. Charlotte took Edmund's hand, and they walked into the house together.